Welcome to Stars and Swords. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week, we continue to discuss the fragmentation of the elves across Middle-earth and beyond, and we introduce the first of our major power players and one of the most controversial characters in the entire Silmarillion, Finwë, better known as the Spirit of Fire himself, Fëanor, which I'm going to tell you, we need a little here in Oklahoma. I am recording this on a bitterly cold night here in the great state of Oklahoma. A little of that Melkorian bitter cold and moderate, right? Just assuaging us tonight. So, assaulting us, perhaps. Entirely the wrong verb there. Before we get to tonight's reading, though, I have to correct an oversight, a somewhat, cavalier misplacing of a document that I definitely meant to cut and paste into a different document and then didn't. Because earlier this week, I released a Q&A episode in which I answered questions on Tukas and Varda and the nature of the Valar and the nature of the dwarves, as well as some thoughts on medievalism and Tolkien's vision of the feudalist utopia, right? But somehow, I completely forgot to answer the question that I had been quietly and gently teasing in advance of that Q&A episode for at least a week. So my apologies to Sarah, but here's the wonderful thing, right? To balance things, it could have been different, but it couldn't have been better, right? Here we are addressing this question tonight when it is perhaps most relevant to our reading of the Silmarillion, because Sarah's question is about gardens and gardening. Sarah writes, quote, "Even in The Lord of the Rings, gardeners are important and are, like the elves, good people. Lorien is a gardener too, and it seems like Yavanna might also be thought of as a gardener. Since Tolkien loves the natural world so much, why are gardens more important than natural landscapes and spaces? Isn't a garden more like Isengard than like Fangorn Forest?" Which, Sarah, wow, what a comparison to draw. Let's take the first part first, right? Yes, I think that Yavanna, to some extent, for sure, but also absolutely Lorien, right? Melian, too, who we discussed last week, prior to her journeys to Middle-earth, absolutely tended to the trees in the gardens of Lorien. Faramir is Prince of the Garden of Ithilien after the War of the Ring. He meets Éowyn in the gardens of the Houses of Healing in Minas Tirith. Of course, we have the inestimable Samwise Gamgee, right? Who is tempted by the ring into imagining himself as the greatest gardener possible, right? Turning the Vale of Gorgoroth into this garden of wildflowers and trees. Instead, settling, of course, for the small garden that is his need and due. Elrond has gardens at Rivendell. Tom Bombadil has a flower garden and a clipped hedge deep in the Old Forest. Caras Galadhon, where Galadriel shows Frodo the mirror of Galadriel, right, is also described as a garden. The Entwives make gardens, as Treebeard tells us. Gardens are exclusively associated with, as Sarah notes in her question there, right, drawing from The Hobbit, good people, capital G, capital P. And this is because I think of all the virtues possessed by the good, creativity is the most important. Artists and craftspeople are the most valued. Artists and craftspeople are generally noble, and the craftspeople who use that most beautiful and varied of media, right, the natural landscape, must therefore be the most noble of all. Like any creativity, it can, of course, be perverted, right? Sarah, as you know, the Shire after the Scouring would be one example, or Isengard would be one example. But ultimately, gardens are, at least in Tolkien's conceptualization of the natural world, right, an improvement on the natural world itself. This is why we get into trouble when we start talking about Tolkien as an environmentalist, right, or as a defender of the natural order of things, because that's true to a point. He opposes industrialization. I'll talk about that in just one moment. But also, he is talking about a world improved by curation, by care, by cultivation, right? The step from the natural world to the garden is the step from the ore and the gemstone deep in the earth and the piece of jewelry, right? These two things are connected, obviously, but it's not true throughout Tolkien's Legendarium, I think, to say that the more natural something is, the deeper to the roots of the creation of Arda something is, the better or more beautiful it is. In fact, it is the craft and the art that make things more beautiful still. So yes, gardeners are absolutely a special order of secondary creators, right? Gardeners are craftspeople like any other in Tolkien, but because they are crafting upon the natural world and with the natural world, and I think to some extent too, because it is a necessarily ongoing process, right? You cannot just make a garden and then let it be. There's a stewardship involved there. There's an ongoing investment of time and presence and attention that I think speaks to Tolkien's conception of what is important and what is most virtuous in the world too. So all of these things together absolutely conspire to give us Sam Gamgee, right? The greatest of all the characters upon the face of Middle-earth. In part, and this is the reference to industrialization that I wanted to pull out, because he's much like the professor himself. This is from a letter, a 1958 letter that Professor Tolkien wrote to Deborah Webster, which begins with a classically Tolkienian opposition to reading biography as literary analysis, right? He opens by saying that there are a few facts about him that are relevant, right? He doesn't like talking about them. He doesn't like discussing his own life in the context of his work. He doesn't like discussing his work in the context of his life. But then he relents a little at the end and gives her a few fun facts nonetheless. Quote, I am, in fact, a hobbit in all but size. I like gardens, trees, and unmechanized farmlands. I smoke a pipe and like good plain food, unrefrigerated, but detest French cooking. I like and even dare to wear in these dull days ornamental waistcoats, which is one of the reasons that I am wearing my own waistcoat this evening, just to feel a little more hobbitish as I sit here discussing the professor's work. So thank you, Sarah, for that question. That was a lot of fun to think about and really engaging to go back through The Lord of the Rings in particular and thinking about gardens, right? I mean, I didn't even include other examples, but we can enfold into that Beorn, classically, right? Presents as having a garden. There is a kind of cultivation there, even in the House of Beorn, even in the wild, which is important. That distinction between the West and the wild is a crucial one back in The Hobbit. But even then, good people have gardens. It's kind of inescapable. Before we get started on this week's reading, then, because it is extremely relevant, and in some senses we are going to rewind a little just to finish up the story of the elves, I wanted to return to our diagram from last week and the sundering of the elves, because we're not quite done just yet. Here we are. So this is the diagram that I presented last week, just showing off the differences between the various strands and communities of elves that are initially encountered by Orome at Cuivanen, and then disperse, most of them, not the Avari, everyone else kind of disperses upon the great journey into the West. So just to clarify a few names that we're definitely going to be spending some time with this week. The Vanyar, the Fair Elves, the first clan, led by Ingwe, right? They are the ones who are most dedicated to being in Valinor. They are the ones who proceed with the most haste across Middle-earth, across, Eregion and across Beleriand, all the way to the coast and then into Aman, the name escapes me for a moment there, into Aman, into Valinor, and then ultimately, end up living very close to Manwë himself, right? They basically abandon all the other elves and do not really enter the story again. But we are going to be spending a lot of time with the Noldor this week, the Deep Elves, the elder of the second clan, the Tatyr, led by Finwë, who is going to be extremely important to our discussions as we move forward, right? The Teleri, they meander through Middle-earth. They linger by the Anduin. They're intimidated by the Misty Mountains. Those who make it past the Misty Mountains, past the Ered Luin into Beleriand, then split again when Elwë, as we discussed a little last week, goes a-wandering in the forest and runs into Melian the Maya in the forest of Nan Elmoth and hangs out for almost 200 years there, during which time his brother Olwë leads the Falmari, the Sea Elves, away. We're going to see that happen in this week's reading. We don't know, to be clear, how much time any of this takes, right? According to a timeline sketched in the history of Middle-earth, we're looking at around 100 years from the first sundering at Cuivanen, when the Avari stay behind and the Eldar begin the journey west, and the arrival of the Eldar, and then another 100 years before even the Valyar and the Noldor make it to Beleriand. So it's a long process, and I'm presenting them here as racing across Middle-earth like Ingwe's a middle-aged dad in charge of an RV, right? Getting everyone corralled, getting everyone out the door at 5:30 in the morning and no rest stops and no distractions on the way. But the truth is that they really take their time. They drift across Middle-earth because, well, for a couple of things. As is noted in the text, we get the strong sense that everything that they encounter on the path is beautiful, is new to them, is rich and is lovely and is just generally worth spending time over. But there's also the idea that the invitation to Valinor is kind of a one-way ticket. It's not that they won't be able to return. It's not that it's an offer of I don't know what, a genial and cordial imprisonment here, but more that it's a kind of permanent relocation rather than just a vacation to the blessed shores of Aman and to Valinor. So the Fëanor and the Noldor make it to the shore. The Teleri arrive around 20 years later and hang out further east, make it to Beleriand 20 years later. Though we note that Elwë of the Teleri, remember, remains friends with Finwë of the Noldor, which is why he's crisscrossing Beleriand, going off to visit his buddy, and 20 years later, he happens to be traveling through Nan Elmoth and meets Melian. And since we're going to be thinking about the geography in this week's reading, let's take a look at the geography of Beleriand at this time. I'm not going to go too deeply into it. We are going to get much, much more when we get to chapter 14 of the Quenta, which is the of Beleriand and its realms chapter. But it helps, I think, to have a rough conceptualization of where the Eldar have found themselves, particularly as we begin this week's reading. So this first slide here, all of these maps are taken from the excellent lotrproject.com, right? These are the interactive maps of Middle-earth and beyond, which are just fantastic. The links to these will be in the show notes. So this is the very familiar map of Middle-earth in the Third Age. Everything looks pretty much as we remember it, right? We can see Gondor and Rohan. We can see the Mirkwood there. We can see the Lonely Mountain there. We've got Eriador, and you can see the Shire just located halfway between the Misty Mountains and the Arid Luin. And then we can see the western coast, right? You can see the Gulf of Lune there. And if you can peek very carefully, you can just about see the Grey Havens tucked away there, from which Frodo and the others take ship into the west. So this is very familiar to us, but this is not the world encountered by the Eldar as they move from east to west. You'll remember me saying that Cuivanen, right, the waking point of the elves, is actually a long way east of even the Sea of Rhun there. It's northeast and a little more east than northeast, I think, but still a long way east from the borders of this map. So it's a long road. It's a long way to go. They linger by the Underwind. They linger by the Misty Mountains. They cross Eriador. They cross the Arid Luin. They cross into... Well, that's the problem, isn't it? Because Beleriand isn't there in the Third Age for reasons which will become apparent to us as we move through the Silmarillion. So let's take a closer look here at the western side of Middle-earth. This is Eriador. You can see here very clearly the Shire in the middle, the Barrow Downs there. You'll note Bree. Here it's far easier to see Mithlond, to see the Grey Havens there at the mouth, I guess, of the Lune flowing into the Gulf of Lune. This is, though, our eastern border of Beleriand. The Arid Luin, as they're presented to us here, the Blue Mountains are the eastern, form, in effect, the eastern border of Beleriand during this period of our discussion, this period of history of Arda. So let's take a look then at Beleriand. And you'll see there on the right, those are the Arid Luin. Those are the same mountains that we were just looking at on the left-hand side of the map. And this is a huge amount of land west of Middle-earth, west of Eregion, at least, right? You'll note here a few things that will stand out to us if we've been doing our reading. We've got Belagost and Nogrod right there on the eastern side of the Arid Luin. I mentioned those during our Q&A session when we were talking about how many more stories of dwarves we get or don't get, more importantly. Nan Elmoth, you'll notice there, the top 20% of the map, just above where it says Estelad there, north of the tag for East Beleriand. Nan Elmoth there, that is the forest where Elwë has found himself currently hanging out with Melian, but things will change. Things will move on from there. You'll note, most importantly perhaps, the great river Sirion flowing down through the middle of the map, coming to the mouth of Sirion there and into the Bay of Balar. Just to the northwest of there, you'll note Arvernian and Nimbrethel. If you're an Eärendil fan, those will make a little flutter in your heart, I'm sure. So this is roughly where we are, right? You'll note that it's a huge amount of land, firstly, and that there's a lot of disparity in our locations. When the third group of the elves, right, when the latecomers finally cross the mountains and catch up, they just kind of hang out in East Beleriand. They're not really in a hurry to make it all the way to the coast. Instead, the Fëanor and the Noldor kind of dash for the coast, but the Teleri hang out a little bit. And that accounts for, well, we're going to find out what happens when they miss their alarm in the pages to come. I'll note here, too, that the Sirion, the river that's flowing down here, which is always gendered as he, which is just a great Tolkienian detail here of his world building. Yes, as Galadriel Becky points out, he tarried in Avernian. Yes, he made a boat of timber felled in Nimbrethel to journey in. God, what a fantastic poem. One of my favorites just to read aloud at parties and things like that. As the people who know me in real life can exhaustively attest, that is the kind of thing that I've been known to do from time to time. But yes, so Sirion here translates, it's in the Sindarin, of course, and it is simply Great River. The Anduin, as noted previously, also the Great River. The difference here is that the Syrian is wide and large, right? The adjectival form there is wide and large, whereas the Anduin is long. These are the things that make these rivers great. The Isle of Belar, too, Balar, as it's noted here. I wanted to call this out because I find this really fascinating. This is essentially a corruption of Valar, right? It is the same word that comes through, I think it's the Teleri into the Sindarin. I think it does a weird little zigzag, linguistically speaking, and that gets us from Valar to Balar here. It's the kind of shift in pronunciation, shift in consonantal pronunciation in particular that Tolkien would have observed many times as a medievalist, right? It's the kind of thing that happens all the time as you're moving through history. And you find that all at once in the 12th century, all of these letters just changed pronunciation all across the Anglophonic word. Yeah. As Gladderbecky says, best poem ever. Completely agreed. My absolute favorite in the entire Legendarium. I just love it. I just love it. I even love the errantry poem, the earlier version that is presented. Where is that presented? Is that presented in Lost Tales? I think it is. The original version of the poem that Bilbo was writing. So good. So strong. Okay, so with all of that said, then, this is where we're going to pick up with Chapter 5 of Eldamar and the Eldalier. Eldamar, as I discussed last time, is Elven home, right? Eldalier, as I mentioned last week, is another word for the Eldar. The Eldar means children of the stars, and Eldalier means people of the Eldar. So there is a distinction there, and I do think it's a functional distinction. I think that, in a sense, the Eldar are the people who began the journey, right? They are the children who woke under the stars and began the journey west, and Eldalier means all of the people who have either undertaken the journey or are descended from the people who undertook the journey, you know? I think there's a distinction there. So let's get into our reading with Ulmo bringing an island. In time, the hosts of the Vanyar and the Noldor came to the last western shores of the Hitherlands. In the north of these shores, in the ancient days after the Battle of the Powers, bent ever westward, until in the northernmost parts of Arda only a narrow sea divided Aman, upon which Valinor was built, from the Hitherlands. But this narrow sea was filled with grinding ice because of the violence of the frosts of Melkor. Therefore, Orome did not lead the hosts of the Eldalier into the far north, but brought them to the fair lands about the river Sirion, and which afterwards were named Beleriand. And from these shores whence first the Eldar looked in fear and wonder on the sea, there stretched an ocean wide and dark and deep between them and the mountains of Aman. Now Ulmo, by the counsel of the Valar, came to the shores of Middle-earth and spoke with the Eldar who waited there, gazing on the dark waves. And because of his words and the music which he made for them on his horns of shell, their fear of the sea was turned rather to desire. Therefore Ulmo uprooted an island which long had stood alone amid the sea, far from either shore since the tumults of the fall of Illuin, and with the aid of his servants he moved it, as it were a mighty ship, and anchored it in the bay of Balar, into which Sirion poured his water. Then the Vanyar and the Noldor embarked upon that isle, and were drawn over the sea, and came at last to the long shores beneath the mountains of Aman. And they entered Valinor and were welcomed to its bliss. But the eastern horn of the island, which was deep grounded in the shoals off the mouths of Sirion, was broken asunder and remained behind. And that, it is said, was the Isle of Balar, to which afterwards Ose often came. We're leaning a little into our etiological myth there at the end, right? This is the kind of story that accounts for odd land formations in real-world cartography. It's the kinds of myths that come up particularly around islands and cliffs and even, isolated mountains. Any kind of unexpected geographical feature that seems to stand out will get some kind of myth explaining its presence, usually in the form of the intervention of some god or great power in the world. So, the Vanyar and the Noldor dash all the way across Middle-earth, as I say, taking a couple hundred years, but surely no more than that. Then they arrive at the mouth of the Sirion, right? All those, that long coastline there in Beleriand, and they look on the ocean and they look out to the mountains of Aman, figuratively. Presumably they cannot see yet the mountains of Aman, and they are afraid because they've never seen such a thing. They've never, they woke at Cuivanen, sure, but they've never seen water on this scale, and there is still fear there. But Ulmo comes to them, he sings to them, he talks with them, he sounds his great horns, his ulamuri, right, and wakes within them the sea longing, right? Their fear of the sea was turned rather to desire. Therefore, Ulmo uproots the island. So there is this island out in the middle of the ocean, far from either shore, which has stood since the tumults of the fall of Illumin, right? When Melkor casts down the lamps and the world is cast into fire, this island has remained all the way out by itself, and Ulmo uproots it, carries it across. The Vanyar and the Noldor jump on. They're happy to go, and then they're swept across to Valinor, to the Pelori, and across the Pelori into Valinor itself, where they are welcomed to its bliss. And we're told, yes, that island has left a chunk of itself behind. This is Tol Eressëa. I guess I should mention too that the hitherlands, as are presented here, that is just another word for Middle Earth, right? The lands that are hither from Aman, right? From the point of view of the Valar here. And I should also mention, since I have the opportunity, the narrow sea filled with grinding ice, where Aman and Middle Earth kind of touch each other near the top of the world, near the northernmost expanse of the world. Remember that we are dealing with a flat Earth at this point, right? A disc-shaped flat Earth near the near the what we'll call for convenience sake the northern rim of the Earth there. Aman and Middle Earth come very close together, but the grinding ice, the Helcaraxa, is the word that we will get for that in the slides to come, which is just, of all of Tolkien's created words, Helcaraxa is one of my absolute favorites. What a fantastic word. So they don't go that way. They go on the island. This is the island of Tol Eressëa. This is the lonely island. We're going to spend a fair amount of time with Tol Eressëa. It's going to be fairly significant. So it's important even now, I think, to kind of rough out a quick conceptualization of what Tol Eressëa is. This is not a small, cute island, despite the fact that we don't really have that many elves traveling from Middle Earth to Valinor right now. It's not a small island. Part of Tolkien's original conception for Tol Eressëa is that it would be Great Britain, is that it would be, Britain itself would occupy this space between Middle Earth, which is to say continental Europe, and Valinor, which is to say the vanished West, right? Not the Americas, though it's very tempting to try and read Valinor as being like Canada. I don't know if we can really go too far down that road and kind of maintain coherence, but, it's a tempting bit of speculation nonetheless. But this would be the kind of semi-etiological, semi-narrative version of the foundational myth of Britain, right? Later, we will get a place on Tol Eressëa that faces Middle Earth that will be called Avalone, right? Where we're obviously kind of echoing, if not outright replicating, the name Avalon from the Arthurian myths. So we're getting a sense of this place that exists almost between worlds, which we'll get to in due course, because we're not yet done with taking Tol Eressëa all the way across the ocean. So if we're envisioning it, we should be envisioning perhaps a really significant landmass, right? Not a small island, but something really big, like a good chunk of country traveling all the way across the Great Sea. And it's not fast. It takes 10 years to cross from Middle-earth to Aman. And then the passage of the Vanyar and the Noldor, right? After embarking upon the isle, they're drawn over the sea. They come at last to the long shores beneath the mountains of Aman, beneath the Pelori there, and they enter Valinor and are welcomed to its bliss. That's it. That's the first two tribes of elves have made it all the way to Valinor. But of course, they're not the only elves. The Teleri have missed the boat. But the Teleri remained still in Middle-earth, for they dwelt in East Beleriand, far from the sea, and they heard not the summons of Ulmo until too late. And many searched still for Elwë their lord, and without him they were unwilling to depart. But when they learned that Ingwe and Finwë and their peoples were gone, then many of the Teleri pressed on the shores of Beleriand and dwelt thereafter near the mouths of Sirion, in longing for their friends that had departed. And they took Olwë, Elwë's brother, to be their king. Long they remained by the coasts of the western sea, and Osei and Weenan came to them and befriended them, and Osei instructed them, sitting upon a rock near to the margin of the land, and of him they learned all manner of sea lore and sea music. Thus it came to be that the Teleri, who were from the beginning lovers of water and the fairest singers of all the elves, were after enamored of the seas, and their songs were filled with the sounds of waves upon the shore. When many years had passed, Ulmo hearkened to the prayers of the Noldor and of Finwë, their king, who were grieved at the long sundering from the Teleri, and besought him to bring them to Aman if they would come. And most of them proved now willing indeed, but great was the grief of Osei when Ulmo returned to the coasts of Beleriand to bear them away to Valinor, for his care was the seas of Middle-earth and the shores of the hitherlands, and he was ill-pleased that the voices of the Teleri should be heard no more in his domain. Some he persuaded to remain, and these were the Falathrim, the elves of the Falas, who in after days had the dwellings of the havens of Brythombar and Eglarest, the first mariners in Middle-earth and the first makers of ships. Círdan the shipwright was their lord. So the Teleri have missed the island. They have missed Tol Eressëa going into the west. They were all the way in eastern Beleriand. Many of them were still looking for Elwë, presumably around the forest, but who knows how far they were ranging abroad. they miss the call, and when they realize that the Vanyar and the Noldor are gone, some of them flee to the west. They flee to the coast. They just camp out, missing their friends. Simultaneously, the Noldor in Valinor are missing the Teleri, right? They're looking back over the waters and thinking, God, it sucks that we're, separated by this giant ocean. Finwë himself, is praying to Ulmo that Ulmo can bring the Teleri forth and unify the elves once more. Those elves who undertook the great journey and made it this far, at least, in Valinor. But we get mostly here the interaction of Osei and Rhiannon with the Teleri. I presume that you remember Osei and Rhiannon. They're Maiar of Ulmo, of course. Osei of the coasts, who for a time rebels under Melkor, but is then forgiven by Ulmo, and Rhiannon, his spouse, who calms him. You remember how sailors pray to Rhiannon to calm Osei and to make travel across the ocean more safe? But he instructs them here, sitting on a rock near to the margin of the land, and of him they learned all manner of sea lore and sea music. So the Philothrim here become, truly sea elves. They become lovers of the sea, and they enfold the sound of the sea, the music of the sea, right, into their own singing, into their own subcreations. And of course, here we wrap up with Círdan, right? We're establishing, we're really throwing forward here into the more recent history of the Legendarium in order to kind of anchor our understanding of what these elves are and are going to be, which is perhaps the most important thing, right? These are the first mariners in Middle-earth. They are the first makers of ships. No one else has made ships yet. And Círdan was their lord. And of course, Círdan, we know because we've read The Lord of the Rings. We recognize this dude. He's name-checked several times in the Council of Elrond, but much more importantly, he's there on like the penultimate page of The Return of the King. He's right there to carry Frodo and Bilbo and Galadriel and Gandalf into the west. He's there at the Grey Havens, taking the white ship to the west. So it's really interesting at this point even that we're getting the sense of how the elves interact with history, being immortal beings, right? Being freed from the tyranny of the short lives of man, right? Which, of course, within the schematic of Middle-earth, not so much a tyranny, for sure. But still, they interact differently, and their lives are long and their ages many. We can talk about that. This is all, I believe, setting the stage for our first discussion of real elven families as we move forward, right? That's really what we're going to do with this chapter, or with the next chapter, but certainly foreshadow here with this chapter. But that's not everyone, because not all of the Teleri go into the west, right? To clarify this, Ulmo comes back with Tol Eressëa, they load the Teleri on, they go back, we'll get to them in a moment. Let's keep going forward. The kinsfolk and friends of Elwë Singolo also remained in the Headlands, seeking him yet, though they would fain have departed to Valinor in the light of the trees if Ulmo and Olwë had been willing to tarry longer. But Olwë would be gone, and at last the main host of the Teleri embarked upon the isle, and Ulmo drew them far away. Then the friends of Elwë were left behind, and they called themselves Eglath, the Forsaken People. They dwelt in the woods and hills of Beleriand rather than by the sea, which filled them with sorrow, but the desire of Aman was ever in their hearts. But when Elwë awoke from his long trance, he came forth from Nan Elmoth with Melian, and they dwelt thereafter in the woods in the midst of the land. Greatly though he desired to see again the light of the trees, in the face of Melian he beheld the light of Aman as in an unclouded mirror, and in that light he was content. His people gathered about him in joy, and they were amazed, for fair and noble as he had been, now he appeared as if he were a lord of the Maiar, his hair as grey silver, tallest of all the children of Iluvatar, and a high doom was before him. So not all of the Teleri go into the west. Not all of the Teleri flee to the coast, fearing that they have been left behind and praying to Ulmo to come back. But that doesn't mean that those elves that are left behind, the ones that are still looking for Elwë Singolo, right? Elwë Grey Raiment there, right? Grey Cloak, effectively. All the ones that are left behind looking for Elwë still pine for the sea. They still long for it. They still feel the same draw to the west as the other elves do, but they don't act upon it. So rather than living on the coast and being tormented by it, they live in the forests. They flee to the center of Beleriand and live in those huge trackless woods there. And you'll note here the naming of themselves the Eglath, right, the Forsaken People. Classic Tolkienian move. What happens when an event occurs? An event occurs, someone gets a new name. In this case, the entire people get a new name, but only for a second, right? Only for a vanishingly short period. Well, not vanishingly short in their experience, but vanishingly short in our accounting of the Silmarillion and the deep histories of Arda, because they are no longer the Eglath when Elwë wakes from his trance and comes forth from Nan Elmoth, with Melian, right? They are no longer forsaken because Elwë is the one who has forsaken them in a sense, but they are also kind of feeling that they are forsaken by all. When Elwë comes forth from the forest, having been transformed by his encounter with Melian, by his love for Melian, right? Now he is even taller than he was before. Now his hair is as gray silver. He looks like a lord of the Maiar, whatever that may mean to these elves, right? He's still clearly a significant being, and they are no longer forsaken. They are no longer, at that point, the Eglath. They become, in effect, at this point, the Sindarin. It's difficult to really parse what happens here between Elwë and Melian. And, well, in one sense, it's difficult to parse what happens between Elwë and Melian, right? In another sense, it's actually very straightforward. Romantically, intuitively, emotionally, it makes a huge amount of sense what happens between the two of them. It connects us. I described in last week's session how this is a classic fairy story, right? A story of fairy an octave higher than it usually is. And I think that that is completely true. Normally, a fairy story will feature a mortal man venturing into the realm of fairy and becoming bewitched, becoming enchanted, becoming ensnared by something, and then returning home only to discover that many years have passed, only to discover that rack and ruin and tragedy have befallen his community, or only to discover that he himself has been transformed in some way. And lo and behold, all three of those things happen to Elwë. He goes into the forest as an elf, yes, but as a fairy is to mortal man, so Melian is to Elwë, right? It's the same kind of, there is a chasm of existence between the two of them. There is simply a higher order of being interacting with a lower order of being, right? So as Elwë goes in, he is bewitched, he is ensnared, he is enchanted, and when he comes out, well, look again, 200 years have passed, rack and ruin and tragedy has befallen his people, and he has been transformed. The difference here, the thing that separates the story of Fingal and Melian from almost all fairy stories, is that there's something joyous here. But even in that joy, right? Even in that immediate joy, in the love between the two of them, the love that will yield no less a being than Luthien herself, right? Even in that moment, there is still tragedy. It is still operatively a fairy story. He's tallest now of all the children of Iluvatar, and a high doom was before him. This judgment, yes, but again, Tolkien is playing with the ambiguity of the word. There is a fate now upon Elwë, who is now Fingal, right? The transition in name is going to be very powerful. We're going to talk about that in just a moment, in fact, as we note the shift of the Silmarillion from being a text primarily referencing the culture of the elves in the Quenya to a text that is primarily referencing the culture of the elves in the Sindarin, for reasons which we aren't going to get to for a few more weeks, but which are going to be extremely powerful when we get there. So let's wrap up and look at the Teleri, because we're not done. They are still transiting west. They are still on Tol Eressëa, crashing through the waves, being pulled by Ulmo and Ossë and Weenan and maybe other Maiar besides. Now Ossë followed after the host of Olwë, and when they come to the Bay of Eldamar, which is Elvenhome, he called to them, and they knew his voice, and begged Ulmo to stay their voyage. And Ulmo granted their request, and at his bidding, Ossë made fast the island, and rooted it to the foundations of the sea. Ulmo did this the more readily, for he understood the hearts of the Teleri, and in the council of the Valar he had spoken against the summons, thinking it were better for the Quendi to remain in Middle-earth. The Valar were little pleased to learn what he had done, and Finwë grieved when the Teleri came not, and yet more when he learned that Elwë was forsaken, and knew that he should not see him again unless it were in the halls of Mandos. But the island was not moved again, and stood there alone in the Bay of Eldamar, and it was called Tol Eressëa, the Lonely Isle. There the Teleri abode as they wished under the stars of heaven, and yet within sight of Aman and the deathless shore. And by that long sojourn apart in the Lonely Isle was caused the sundering of their speech from that of the Vanyar and the Noldor. This amazing, impossible, miraculous thing has happened. And you know what's most important about it? The linguistics. The language has started to change. Tolkien again revealing his true colors to us. So, to be clear, so Ulmo brings forth Tol Eressëa from the middle of the Sea of Belegar and carries it to Beleriand. Ingwe's people, the Valyar, Finwë's people, the Noldor climb aboard. They're taken to Valinor. They are now living there happily. Some years later, Ulmo brings Tol Eressëa back across, partly at Finwë's urging, right? Some Teleri decide to stay on the shore of Beleriand. They become the Philathrim. Some stay and look for Elwë, becoming for a while the Eglath, but not for long. The rest hop on Tol Eressëa and head out. So this is the second journey and the last journey of Tol Eressëa across the sea. They get almost all the way to Valinor, and Osei calls out to them. Osei, the host of Olwe that he's calling out to, this is the Teleri, right? Olwe is now officially their king. Osei followed after the host of Olwe, and when they came to the Bay of Eldamar, which is Elvenhome, he calls to them, and they know his voice and beg Ulmo to stay their voyage. And it's unclear if in that moment they mean permanently or temporarily. Hey, slow down. Osei's right behind us. We really want to hang out with that dude. We love that dude. He taught us sea music. We love him. We're crazy for him. But what happens here is that at Ulmo's bidding, Osei binds Tol Eressëa to the sea floor. It will never move again. And the reason for that, as it's presented here, is that Ulmo does not think that all of the children ought to be living in Valinor. Remember, when we had our council, he was the one who protested. He was the one who said, no, actually, maybe they should be in Middle-earth, using their many skills and gifts and talents to help heal Middle-earth and be the lords, the masters, the inhabitants, at least, right, of that domain. And the Valar, little pleased to learn what he had done. Finwë, grieving when the Teleri came not. And here's the thing. Elvenhome, right, as it's presented to us, the place where the elves live in Eldamar, right, the place where the elves live in Aman, or upon Aman, in Valinor, near Valinor, next to Valinor. It's large, but it's not wide. Tol Eressëa is generally depicted as being maybe 15, maybe 20 miles off the coast. It's a distance, but it's not an unconquerable distance. We're not just seeing a geographical distinction here, right? It's not that Finwë could not fathom a way of getting across the ocean to visit with the Teleri on Tol Eressëa. It's not that this is an insurmountable obstacle for the great Noldor, right? The craftsmen of the elves. It's not that they couldn't come up with some way of doing it. It's that there is a cultural difference now, which is signified by the change in language, right? The Teleri abode as they wished under the stars of heaven, and yet within sight of Aman on the deathless shore, and by that long sojourn apart on the lonely isle was caused the sundering of their speech from that of the Vanyar and the Noldor. It is a further sundering. It is a further fundamental shift in identity and in culture, right? It's not just that the Teleri are distinct now from, they're geographically distinct from the Vanyar and the Noldor. They are now even more distinct than they were at any point previously in the Great Journey. But we're not done, because the elves have to have places to live here in Elvenhome, here in Eldamar, and they're going to start building, right? To bring us all the way back to the discussion of gardens and gardening at the beginning of tonight's session, this is cultivation. They are going to create, they are going to construct, and they are going to do, well, beautiful things, right? Here we are. To these the Valar had given a land and a dwelling place. Even among the radiant flowers of the tree-lit gardens of Valinor, they longed still at times to see the stars, and therefore a gap was made in the great walls of the Pelori, and there in a deep valley that ran down to the sea, the Eldar raised a high green hill, Tuna it was called. From the west the light of the trees fell upon it, and its shadow lay ever eastward, and to the east it looked toward the Bay of Elvenhome and the lonely isle and the shadowy seas. Then through the Calacadia, the pass of light, the radiance of the blessed realm streamed forth, kindling the dark waves to silver and gold, and it touched the lonely isle, and its western shore grew green and fair. There bloomed the first flowers that were ever east of the mountains of Aman. Upon the crown of Tuna, the city of the elves was built, the white walls and terraces of Tirion, and the highest of the towers of that city was the tower of Ingwe, Minden Eldalieva, whose silver lamp shone far out to the mists of the sea. Few are the ships of mortal men that have seen its slender beam. In Tirion upon Tuna, the Vanyar and the Noldor dwelt long in fellowship. And since of all things in Valinor, they loved most the white tree, Yavanna made for them a tree like to a lesser image of Telperion, save that it did not give light of its own being. Galathilion it was named in the Sindarin tongue. This tree was planted in the courts beneath the Minden, and there flourished, and its seedlings were many in Eldamar. Of these, one was afterwards planted in Tol Eressëa, and it prospered there, and was named Celeborn. Thence came in the fullness of time, as is elsewhere told, Nimloth, the white tree of Numenor. Again, we're getting this throw forward, right? We're getting this forward pass into the pages of history. We're calling out things which would be familiar to the elvish readers of this text, but also, yes, to us, readers of The Lord of the Rings, the fans of Tolkien's entire legendarium, right? We're getting things now that are resonant. We're getting the sense that we are drawing closer to a realm that is compatible with our own experience, with our own understanding of life and death and conflict and beauty, right? We're no longer in the realm of gods, the Valar, right? we're now somewhere closer to the ground, and we're going to continue, right? That notion of descent, just as the Ainur descend into Arda and become the Valar, right? We are now descending through history. This is very much consistent with Tolkien's medievalist view of history, which is a story of decline. We are moving closer to the ground, and things are getting more familiar to us, but that is not a good thing, right? The age of man is not the highest point of history in the annals of Middle-earth. So Tirion upon Tuna, and we kind of have to acknowledge, right? It is an easy joke to make, perhaps, but I've mentioned this a couple times already in our Silmarillion series. This is Tolkien either not knowing or not caring that a word in his constructed language looks and feels and sounds like a word in the real world, right? We talked about this with the plural of Fëa, right? The spirit which drives those creatures, drives those sapient, sentient creatures upon the face of Arda, right? The secret fire within them. The plural of Fëa is Fëanor, but looks like fear, and that's confusing. And if you were writing, if George R.R. Martin was sitting down to write something like that, he would change that word, probably at the insistence of his editor, right? Assuming that George R.R. Martin has written anything at all within the last 5 years. But Tolkien wouldn't do it, or couldn't do it, or was unwilling to see it, or simply unable to see it. Tuna is what it is called. You know why it's called Tuna? Because it's a green hill. We have been reading Tolkien long enough to guess at the literal translation of Tuna. That's right, it's Green Hill. It's just right there. It falls out of the language in a completely effortless way. It is simply what it is, and thus that is what it is called. So we end up in a weird place where we're talking about this gorgeous crystalline marbled city of the Vanyar and the Noldor called Tirion upon Tuna, which you can go so far to try and avoid it. Martin Shaw, I know, in the earlier audiobooks, and even Andy Serkis to a certain extent, he's a little more shamefaced about it when he tries to do it, but we're really trying to put the emphasis, we're stretching to put the emphasis on that second syllable and talk about Tirion upon Tuna, but it's really not. It's Tirion upon Tuna. We just have to live with it, and we can be amused by it, but also it's kind of cool. So it has a music to it as well, which I think is genuinely undeniable. I'm not sure that I would generally say that. And my situation is a little different too, because being British, some of my accent has survived and persisted, and I still want to resist the Midwestern urge to flatten all of my vowel sounds. So I'm naturally going to lean toward a liquid U when I'm talking about tuna, you know, the canned fish, or I guess the uncanned fish. I just normally encounter it in a canned form. I'm also just saying canned now, which is annoying even myself. Right, canned fish. Tuna, to me, tuna would be the Green Hill here. In the Kalakiria, right, the Pass of Light. So literally what happens is that the Pelori are parted. They are parted like the Red Sea. They are separated to create this deep valley flowing forth from Valmar, from the Azalahar, right? The mound upon which Telperion and Laurelin. Pause here. Laurelin is what it should be. And I'm not generally going to be much of a stickler about pronunciation, but it occurred to me that it should be Laurelin, and I double-checked, because the AU sound in all of Tolkien's writing, right, gives us ow. It gives us smaug, not smog. It gives us owle, not ole. It gives us this rich, round vowel sound, and I really like that, and I really want to preserve it, but the cost of that, the cost of smaug and owle is Laurelin, and I'm going to try to stick to that, though I cannot promise in moments of spontaneity that I will be able to maintain it. So anyway, the Valar come together because the elves still want to dwell under the starlight to some extent, right? They're not accustomed to just the lights of the trees. They want something that is deep to them, is literally a spiritual connection, right, to the starlight of Varda. They still want to experience that. So the Valar part the Pelori. They create this deep valley flowing east from Valmar, flowing east from the trees down to the ocean, so that the light of the trees can finally shine out past the Pelori. This is the first time in the history of of Arda, that the light is visible from somewhere outside of Aman, from somewhere outside of Valinor. And you see, even as it touches the lonely isle, its western shore grows green and fair. There bloomed the first flowers that were ever east of the mountains of Aman. Because remember, there were no flowers in Middle-earth prior to the destruction of the lamps and the relocation of the Valar into Valinor. The flowers come later. Everything in Middle-earth is green. Presumably that is still true, right? As the elves are traversing Middle-earth, they're not seeing flowers. They're not even necessarily seeing all the great sights that Valinor contains. They're seeing this beautiful, sure, but somewhat monochromatic version of the wilds of Middle-earth. And upon the crown of Tuna, the city of the elves was built, the white walls and terraces of Tirion. So here we see exactly the extension of that gardening instinct that I was talking about right at the beginning of the show in response to Sarah's question, right? It's not enough that we live harmoniously. It's not enough that we live in the natural world. There is a beauty and a wonder and a power to construction, to creation, to being artists, to being craftspeople. Building the city of Tirion upon Tuna is a good thing. It is a beautiful thing. It is a dwelling place for the Vanyar and the Noldor. They dwell there long in fellowship, right? And because even here in the city that they have built, they're forging this, well, I don't even think alliance is the right word, right? Something much, much stronger than that, this bond with the Valar. Because they love most of the White Tree, Yavanna makes them kind of a White Tree of their own, right? She makes this image of Telperion, though it does not radiate light. The only light here is still coming from Telperion and Laurelin directly, but they have their own White Tree. And that White Tree is, as I said, going to pass into the pages of history. It is going to be significant all the way to the end of The Lord of the Rings, right? This is the White Tree of Gondor. This is where all of this comes from. This is the moment of inspiration that really sparks that. And it's beautiful. So they are now settled here, and this is a good thing, right? Everything's going to be just fine. Manwë and Varda loved most the Vanyar, the fair elves, but the Noldor were beloved of Aule, and he and his people came often among them. Great became their knowledge and their skill, yet even greater was their thirst for more knowledge, and in many things they soon surpassed their teachers. They were changeful in speech, for they had great love of words, and sought ever to find names more fit for all the things they knew or imagined. And it came to pass that the masons of the house of Finwë, quarrying in the hills after stone, for they delighted in the building of high towers, first discovered the earth gems, and brought them forth in countless myriads. And they devised tools for the cutting and shaping of gems, and carved them in many forms. They hoarded them not, but gave them freely, and by their labour enriched all Valinor. Exactly, as Galadriel is pointing out here in the chat, it's like when the Valar constructed and molded the earth in the beginning. Yes, it's exactly the same creative impulse, right? It's smaller. It is of smaller order, right? There's a way in which we can read the children of Iluvatar as being engaged in a kind of tertiary creation, right? Kind of the primary creation of Iluvatar, the secondary creation of the Ainur becoming the Valar as they enter into Arda, as they descend into Arda. But this is the same instinct. All good creatures create. This is a fundamental truth of Tolkien, right? It's an inextricable part of his personal philosophy, right? There's that moment in Mythopoeia, which, excuse me, I don't have the text in front of me or indeed yet memorized, but there's the moment in Mythopoeia where he talks about refusing to give up his small scepter, right? It's this tiny little thing that he can do that on the scale of God isn't worth anything, right? It's insignificant, but he will not yield the right to do it because it is important, because it is, in a sense, the thing that gives life definition. It is the thing that makes this whole endeavor worthwhile, is the creative act. The good creative act and the bad creative act, as we're going to see as we move forward. But now we're getting, well, what are we getting? We're getting the good creative act, yes, but we're starting to see some cracks appear, aren't we? We're starting to see something in the Noldor here, in the spirit of the Noldor, closer now to Aule. Manwë and Varda loved most of the Vanyar, the fair elves. The Vanyar are going to become directly connected, also like physically proximate to Manwë and Varda at Taniquetil, and that's why they are going to pass out of the story, because they are eventually going to stop living at Tirion upon Tuna at all. But the Noldor are beloved of Aule, and he's teaching them the skills and the crafts, and then they are surpassing their teachers, right? They are changeful in speech, for they had great love of words and sought ever to find names more fit for all the things they knew or imagined. What is one of the ways in which creativity can express itself, can reveal itself? The creation of words, the creation of language, right? The thing that defined these elves at the beginning, those who speak. That is their original title for themselves. We are the ones who can speak. And now, wow, we are just loving the ability to speak and finding new and better words, names more fit for all things that they knew or imagined. We're coming up with words for things that don't even exist. We're coming up with words that are just in the abstract schematic. That's how much we love language. And then the gems, too, right? First discovering the earth gems and brought them forth in countless myriads, and they devised tools for the cutting and shaping of gems and carved them in many forms. They hoarded them not, but gave them freely, and by their labor enriched all Valinor. You'll note there, all Valinor, not just Tirion upon Tuna, not just their city, but all Valinor. Valmar for sure, but also presumably the halls of each of the individual Valar, right? I'm sure that Aule's great mansions and workshops were bedecked with gems brought forth from the earth by the people of Finwë, by the Noldor, because they don't put any value on the created thing. They put value on the act of creation, right? Not unlike Aule himself. So that's the narrative over for a little while, because we're going to move into a slide that I have entitled The Begatting Part 1. This is the first time that we're really going to get into the family history. We're going to move through this quickly because I've got a diagram on the far side that I hope will lay things out a little more clearly. There are things that we can pull out from this passage. We've got, a slide and a half really to move through here. There are things that we can pull out, but they're not all significant. So I'm going to try and highlight everything, but then we'll distill it down and pull out what we really need to focus on as we move forward. This is the Begatting Part 1. The Noldor afterwards came back to Middle-earth, and this tale tells mostly of their deeds. Therefore the names and kinship of their princes may here be told in that form which these names later bore in the tongue of the elves of Beleriand. Finwë was king of the Noldor. The sons of Finwë were Fëanor and Fingolfin and Finarfin. But the mother of Fëanor was Miriel Serinde, whereas the mother of Fingolfin and Finarfin was Indis of the Vanyar. Fëanor was the mightiest in skill of word and of hand, more learned than his brothers. His spirit burned as a flame. Fingolfin was the strongest, the most steadfast, and the most valiant. Finarfin was the fairest and the most wise of heart, and afterwards he was a friend of the sons of Olwe, lord of the Teleri, and had to wife Earwyn, the swan maiden of Alqualonde, Olwe's daughter. The 7 sons of Fëanor were Maithros the tall, Maglor the mighty singer, whose voice was heard far over land and sea, Caligorm the fair, and Caranthir the dark, Curufin the crafty, who inherited most of his father's skill of hand, and the youngest Amrod and Amras, who were twin brothers, alike in mood and face. In later days, they were great hunters in the woods of Middle-earth, and a hunter also was Caligorm, who in Valinor was a friend of Orome, and often followed the Vala's horn. So, Finwë was the king. Well, I guess even before we get to that, this tale tells mostly of their deeds, right? Hey, what is the Silmarillion? The Silmarillion is really the history of the Noldor. It is the history of this particular family, right? Just Finwë's family here as we set up shop in Valinor. The Noldor afterwards came back to Middle-earth. So we're already, again, throwing forward in the narrative. We're at a point now where we need this kind of inflection in order to explain the narrative choices that are being made. The narrative choices not being made by Professor Tolkien here, but the narrative choices being made by the elven authors of this text in the first place. The Noldor afterwards came back to Middle-earth, and this tale tells mostly of their deeds. Therefore, the names and kinship of their princes may here be told in that form which these names later bore in the tongue of the elves of Beleriand, that is to say, Sindarin, not Quenya. We're moving now into Sindarin. We're not really explaining why there is like an event which happens which demands that these names be rendered in Sindarin, but we'll get to all of that. That's not the important part right now. The important part right now is these are the names by which these people will be known hereafter, thus we're introducing them by these names now. Finwë was king of the Noldor. This is Finwë who wakes at Cuivanen, who is the leader of the Noldor from the moment that the great journey begins, who follows them all the way who leads them all the way west across Middle-earth, who embarks upon Tol Eressëa the first time, who shows up here, who starts building Tirion, and all the great accomplishments of the Noldor here, right, are all led by Finwë. And Finwë has 3 sons, Fëanor, Fingolfin, and Finarfin, but they are not sons of the same mother. Only the first son, Fëanor, was born of Miriel Serinde. Miriel Serinde here, jewel daughter. Miriel is jewel daughter, like gem daughter, right? And Serinde means like the embroideress, means like someone who is skilled at needlework and embroidering. But then Fëanor marries for a second time. He marries Indis of the Vanyar, and thereby fathers Fingolfin and Finarfin, Fëanor's half-brothers, right? This is going to be huge, and we're going to get into the circumstances of this in the pages to come, but this distinction, this rift, in a sense, it's going to be very difficult to pin down exactly who is to blame for what comes, right? You can argue long and hard into the night about who is to blame for what happens next in this story? And by what happens next, I mean a good, decent chunk of the Quenta Silmarillion, right? Some people really love Finwë, and some people do not like Finwë at all and blame him for a lot of what follows hereafter. Some people really love Fëanor. Some people really hate Fëanor and blame him for a great deal of what comes hereafter. Some people blame Miriel which we'll get to in a little part. I think that is pretty noxious and indefensible myself, but, we'll discuss it as we get to it. So we have here, we have the accounting of these three siblings, Fëanor on the one side, Fingolfin and Finarfin on the other, and then we have their sons, right? Or their sons, just Fëanor's sons. Maethros, Maglor, Celegorm, Caranthir, Curufin, and the twins Amrod and Amnas. Though, Celegorm and Caranthir, presented as the fair and the dark, are also kind of the twins too, right? They're not literally twins, but they are paired quite often. Let's move on to the rest of this begatting part 2, right? The sons of Fingolfin were Fingon, who was afterwards king of the Noldor in the north of the world, and Turgon, lord of Gondolin. Their sister was Arathel the White. She was younger in the years of the Eldar than her brothers, and when she was grown to full stature and beauty, she was tall and strong and loved much to ride and hunt in the forests. There she was often in the company of the sons of Fëanor, her kin, but to none was her heart's love given. Arfainial she was called, the White Lady of the Noldor, for she was pale, though her hair was dark, and she was never arrayed but in silver and white. The sons of Finarfin were Finrod the Faithful, who was afterwards named Felagund, Lord of Caves, Orodreth, Angrod, and Aignor. These four were as close in friendship as the sons of Fingolfin, as though they were all brothers. A sister they had, Galadriel, most beautiful of all the house of Finwë. Her hair was lit with gold as though it was caught in a mesh, the radiance of Laurelin. Another familiar name there, Galadriel. Let's take a look then at the family tree as it's laid out to us here. I'll note too, just a pause here, obviously, Fingon and Turgon, right? The king of the Noldor in the north of the world, and Turgon, lord of Gondolin, and it is entirely possible, even coming into this as a reader of the Lord of the Rings, that Gondolin is also like ringing a bell in your head. There's some echoing here. You're really getting a sense of the sweep and the shape of history, though not yet its cause and effect, not yet the actual sequence of events, right? There is, I think, a beautifully crafted sense of doom about all of this. There's a beautifully crafted sense of something bad is coming, and I don't yet know what it is. Even as a reader of The Lord of the Rings, if you're coming first to the Silmarillion and you're making it this far, I think you have a sense that, oh man, things are about to go wrong. And the narrative text has also kind of thrown forward a couple times, right? We've talked about Elwë's high doom before him. We've talked about Mandos coming out and saying, things are not going to go well here, offering this sense that things are going to go down. Let's take a look then at the house of Finwë. So Finwë and Midiel, they marry, and they have together Fëanor. Finwë's second wife, Indis, yields Fingolfin and Finarfin. We'll talk about exactly how this goes down and what happens to Miriel in the pages to come. So this is our kind of first tier here. We do need to remember Fëanor and Fingolfin and Finarfin. I think that this is important. Galadriel is asking a fantastic question here in the chat that is going to absolutely derail me for a little bit. Let's go. Galadriel writes, did Tolkien write this part after he knew what the future of the tales was, or was he just setting up names to fill in later? And the answer is, kind of inextricably both. The version of this story is fairly... The roots of the story are fairly early, but the version of the story that we get in the Silmarillion is fairly late. But all of these stories are kind of coexistent and co-evolving. They're being written and rewritten as we move forward. There's a lot of stuff in the Lost Tales and Unfinished Tales. No. Now I'm struggling to remember where in the giant History of Middle-earth series all of this stuff is. There's a lot more in... it might even be the peoples of Middle-earth, I forget. There's a section on the rights and the... forgive me, the word is escaping me now, but how the elves live, right? How the Eldar in particular live, and how their kind of social customs are engineered. And a lot of that stuff postdates the Silmarillion and gives a lot of insight that some people will try to apply retroactively to the books. I'm trying to preserve our sense of the Silmarillion here as a text as presented to us by Professor Tolkien, yes, but also by Christopher, right? We're getting this edited collection of stories that do try to unify all the many disparate versions in different parts of the Legendarium. So is Tolkien inventing these names now, knowing that he is going to use them later? Is he retroactively fitting the names from the Lord of the Rings into the Legendarium after the fact? Not so much that, right? The reason that he writes Galadriel in The Lord of the Rings is that he knows who Galadriel is because he's been writing these stories for 30 years. He's been writing these stories basically all his adult life. He keeps coming back to these same stories, keeps revising them, changing them, seeing how they fit together and come apart, right? Mentioned earlier the the notion that Tol Eressëa is actually the islands of Great Britain and how that falls out of the Legendarium, right? A lot of the geographical stuff falls out of the Legendarium. It's supposed to be much earlier in his conception of Middle-earth, of Arda in general. The geographical connection between that fictional world and our real world is much closer. It's much tighter. He really wants to give that etiological myth. He wants to give that explanatory myth that tells us where we came from, right? As British people, or as British people. He gives not one whit for the British people, for the English people, right? He wants to give this foundational myth for English culture. So a lot of that is grounded in geography, right? Other places get to do that all the time, but it kind of falls out of the Legendarium as he develops it. But these characters have been here for the longest time. These characters have been sticking around. We mentioned back in the first session that one of the first names that he uses when he's writing his Legendarium, the first piece, if you ask me, right? The first piece that he uses includes Eärendil, right? He's and it's not quite the Eärendil that it will be later, but it is a version of Eärendil. So these names are floating around. This is an act of, what is it, synthesis, more than it is either a retroactive attempt to explain and to justify his own continuity, right? This is not The Secret History of Middle-earth, a book that is written after the fact in order to justify the choices that were made in the creation of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, but nor is it a completely clean and ordered, page 1, page 2, page 3 retelling of a fictional mythology. There's something in between the two. It's part of what makes Tolkien so completely fascinating, and it's certainly something that yields complexity. It is certainly one of the factors that makes Professor Tolkien's writing so enchanting and so, I want to use a better word than rich, right? Like the Noldor, I want now to seek a better word for this thing of my imagining. I want to use a word that really communicates the resonance that you find within Tolkien, right? Because there are so many connections between different parts of the Legendarium. There are so many that are conscious and that are deliberate. There are echoes up and down the Legendarium, right? We will see, again, we're about to see, spoilers, y'all, but we're about to see Fëanor fall. We're about to describe a character who is to us already very familiar. And he's going to be familiar to us time and time again as we move all the way through the Legendarium and see what happens to people like Fëanor, to beings like Melkor, right? There are definite associations there. But there are also these unintended little resonances. There are all these tiny little echoes and things that will come from non-canonical versions of the story, right? That will come from unpublished versions of the stories, or from versions that are later collected or are later juxtaposed by Christopher in the assemblage of the history of Middle-earth. It's so wonderfully. I can't really give you. Glorfin David's asking, did Tolkien ever retcon? Absolutely. I mean, stories were changed all the time. He would rarely sit down and write another version of the story, right? And in fact, it's appropriate, Glorfin David, that you should ask me this, because Glorfindel is one of the biggest retcons in Tolkien's Legendarium. He sets out a version of that story, then just reuses that character's name later in a different instance, realizes these two things are incompatible, and in an attempt to understand, and this was always, I think, true of his creative approach, right? It's less that he's coming up with things off of a blank page, but rather seeking to understand the things that he has written and fit them together. He comes up with a much more sophisticated take on what happens to elves after they die, after they physically die. What happens to their fate? What happens to their spirit? And through this comes to the notion of a kind of bodily reincarnation through the halls of Mandos, which is a really great idea. It's a really fascinating idea that he then continues to develop way past the publication of The Lord of the Rings and way past the material that makes it into the Silmarillion, right? There are later papers about how, what we're going to get the opportunity to talk about this now as we talk about Muriel. So I'm going to go back to the to the slides here, but great questions, you guys, great questions. Okay, so we're here. Fëanor, Fingolfin, Finarfin. We do, I'm afraid, probably have to remember the three of them. We do probably have to remember these three guys. Fëanor obviously is going to be the most significant as we go forward. Let's lay out then the children of Fëanor, right? Maithros, Maglor, Celegorm, Caranthir, Curufin, Amrod, and Amaras. Do we need to remember all of them? Yeah, kind of. I mean, really remembering them in terms of like having a sense of their names, right? There are 2 M's, 2 A's, 3 C's in the middle, and having a sense of those one-word descriptions that we get in the book, right? Maithros the tall, Maglor the singer, Curufin the crafty. Yeah, we should definitely remember Curufin. He's going to be a little bit significant later. Take a look at Fingolfin's children here, Fingon, Turgon, and Adithel. Adethel, good news. You don't really have to remember Adethel. She's not going to be terribly significant as we move forward. Fingon and Turgon, on the other hand, very significant as we go on. And then, as Fëanor lays out here, Finrod, Orodreth, Angrod, Aegnor, and Galadriel. Luckily, we won't have any trouble remembering Galadriel. So again, at this point, as is so often the case, it's not really important that you remember every detail. It's not really important that you sit down and internalize this. Vinton, I know you're listening to this after the fact. You don't really need this as another bookmark, though you can, by all means, print it out and make a bookmark out of it. But it's not really important that you have them, because when we get to these characters, we're going to reintroduce them, right? Tolkien is not trying to write an ergodic text. Were you guys with me back when I discussed the Terry Miles book Rabbits, and I was talking about, I think it's Arseth's notion of the ergodic text, this text that requires work in order to decipher, right? It is not transparent to the experience of the reader. It requires some kind of solving of a puzzle or like the remembering of arcane knowledge in order to unlock the meaning of the text on the page in front of you. That's not Tolkien's jam. That's not what he's trying to do. He's not going to go out of his way to really make things super clean and self-explanatory, but he's not trying to baffle us. He is trying to give us something that feels authentic to the kind of medieval family histories and the way that these family histories interact that we would get in real life. One other thing worth noting here before we move on from the children of Fëanor in particular, Fëanor is really quite prolific. 7 children is a large number for elves. 4 is usual, 5 is rare. We're told in the expanded material that nobody ever has more kids than Fëanor. None of the elves have ever had more children than Fëanor, yeah. Okay, let's, Fingolfin, says Commander Becky, was the one who invented the golf course. Consulted on the creation of golf, as we know. It was a hobbit who invented golf, but yes, very good. Okay, let's move on. Oh, I wanted to add, I extended, just because what is a family tree without some people of incident? Let's extend the family tree a little bit. This is not directly important right now, but it does help us kind of anchor where these branches of the family tree are going. So I've just pulled out a few of the latter generations here, right? Curufin, who is noted as having, right, most of his father's craft, right? He inherits most his father's craft and skill. Well, Curufin is going to be the father of Celebrimbor, who is going to someday craft the Rings of Power. That's super important. So we can see the direct line there, right? From Fëanor and his craft and his skill through Curufin to Celebrimbor. Fingolfin's children, on the other hand, Fingon is going to be the father of Gilgalad, who will someday be the last High King of the Noldor. Adethel is going to be the mother of Maeglin, who is just a really dark figure. Maeglin is a guy that I really have a hard time kind of wrapping my head around. Maeglin, I almost hesitate to say, I'm hesitating like I'm giving out a huge spoiler. You guys, Gondolin is going to fall, and it is going to fall because of Maeglin. He is going to betray Gondolin to Melkor, one of the greatest acts of treachery in the entire history of Middle-earth. It's an absolutely shocking turn of events. Turgon, the middle child there, the second son of Fingolfin, we're going to skip a couple generations, but then he is going to be Turgon is the great-grandparent of Eärendil, who is, of course, the father of Elrond. So that's that line. We're very familiar with that guy. And then the only other one that I want to call out here is Galadriel over there, the only daughter of Finarfin, who is going to be the mother of Celebrian, who is Elrond's wife, who will ultimately marry Elrond, and who will be the mother of Arwen Evenstar. So that's kind of that side of the family, all working out totally comfortably, right? Nothing wrong with just comfortably marrying your cousin. But I mean, when there are 150 elves in the entire world, maybe at some point you have to marry your cousin. When there are 150 elves in the world and you live for untold thousands of years, maybe at some point you have to marry your cousin, because there just aren't that many other options. That sounds like a weird defense. I've left myself in an odd position having to justify that. Yes. Okay. Let's move on and talk about the Teleri and the founding of the other city, right? We're talking about Eldamar, we're talking about Elvenhome, we're talking about the residences of the elves upon Aman, within Valinor, in effect. But not everybody lives in Tirion upon Tuna. There is a whole other city built by the Teleri eventually. Let's move on to that. Here must be told how the Teleri came at last to the land of Aman. Through a long age they dwelt in Tol Eressëa, but slowly their hearts were changed and were drawn toward the light that flowed out over the sea to the lonely isle. They were torn between the love of the music of the waves upon their shores and the desire to see again their kindred and to look upon the splendor of Valinor. But in the end, the desire of the light was the stronger. Therefore Ulmo, submitting to the will of the Valar, sent to them Ose, their friend, and he through grieving taught them the craft of shipbuilding. And when the ships were built, he brought them as his parting gift many strong-winged swans. Then the swans drew the white ships of the Teleri over the windless sea, and thus at last and latest they came to Aman and the shores of Eldamar. There they dwelt, and if they wished they could see the light of the trees, and could tread the golden streets of Valmar and the crystal stairs of Tirion upon Tuna, the green hill. But most of all, they sailed in their swift ships on the waters of the Bay of Alvenholm, or walked in the waves upon the shore with their hair gleaming in the light beyond the hill. Many jewels the Noldor gave them, opals and diamonds and pale crystals, which they strewed upon the shores and scattered in the pools. Marvellous were the beaches of Elendë in those days. And many pearls they won for themselves from the sea, and their halls were of pearl, and of pearl were the mansions of Olwe at Alqualonde, the haven of the swans, lit with many lamps. For that was their city, and the haven of their ships. And those were made in the likeness of swans, with beaks of gold and eyes of golden jet. The gate of that harbour was an arch of living rock sea-carved, and it lay upon the confines of Eldamar, north of the Calakiria, where the light of the stars was bright and clear. So over time, living as they do on Tol Eressëa, the Teleri are getting restless. They're still feeling the appeal of Valinor. They still want to go ashore. They want to leave behind their lonely island and go and be with their kin. They want to see the trees. But we should note, they are changed. This is part of the reason why they stay, narratively speaking, why they stay on Tol Eressëa, why we observe that cultural shift that we described before. When they go ashore, they are not going to intermingle. I mean, they are going to intermingle, but not completely intermingle with the Noldor who remain, right? They're going to set themselves apart. They go to see the trees. They go hang out with the Noldor. They receive gifts of gemstones. They're super chill. They're having a fantastic time, but they're also distinct. They are also different. So they create for themselves Alqualonde, the haven of the swans, this city that lies north of the Calakiria, north of the gap in the mountains, right? So it itself does not receive the light from the trees. It itself is shrouded in the shadow of the Pelori and is starlit and lit by many lamps too, right? I was going to, what is the direct quote there? Oh, it's lit with many lamps. Okay, I said it by accident already. This is their city. So what is happening here in this first passage I find really very sad, right? We get this angst. They're torn between the love of the music of the waves upon their shores and their desire to see again their kindred and to look upon the splendor of Valinor. In the end, desire of the light was the stronger. Therefore, Ulmo, crucially, submitting to the will of the Valar say, hey, those elves want to come and see us. You let them come and see us. So Ulmo submits and sends them Ose, their friend, and he, through grieving, taught them the craft of shipbuilding. Why is Ose grieving? Because Ose is not the Maiar of the shores of Aman. He's not the Maiar of the shores of Valinor. He is the Maiar of the shores of the Hitherlands, of Middle-earth. This is another kind of sundering. He is not going to see them again. He is not going to get to play with them and dance with them and sing with them as they are sailing their white ships up and down the Bay of Eldamar here. This is a parting, and it's tragic, right? When the ships were built, he brought them as his parting gift many strong-winged swans, which I think is the fusion of like Ulmo and Manwë, right? There is a quality of the swan that we discussed the eagles, and we discussed, the bringing together of Yavanna's creative instinct and Manwë's creative instinct. I see something of Ulmo here too, and I wonder how much he is involved in the creation of the swans. Then the swans drew the white ships of the Teleri over the windless sea, and thus at last and latest they came to Aman and the shores of Eldamar. And then they build their city. They too, just like the Noldor before them, just like the Vanyar before them, build their city. They build a city that suits them, a starlit city, a lamplit city that nonetheless gives them access to those two things which they love the most. All of Valinor and the Bay of Alvenholm, the Bay of Eldamar, so they can sail in their swift ships because the gift of Ose endures. Though he and they are now separated, they still carry that love of the coastal water. They still carry the love of the sound of the waves and the experience of the waves, the experience of the tides even, I'm sure. It's a really beautiful part. And also casually, Alqualonde, the haven of the swans, Swan Haven, right, literally. The word Alqualonde is absolutely one of my favorites. I know I mentioned Helcaraxa earlier. I'm just going to call out all of my very favorites that we get, even in the rich bounty that the professor offers us here. So we've got the Noldor now residing in Tirion upon Tuna. We've got the Teleri, now all that they have become, now residing in Alqualonde. And it's time for the Vanyar to go their own way. As the ages passed, the Vanyar grew to love the land of the Valar and the full light of the trees, and they forsook the city of Tirion upon Tuna, and dwelt thereafter upon the mountain of Manwë, or about the plains and woods of Valinor, and became sundered from the Noldor. But the memory of Middle-earth under the stars remained in the hearts of the Noldor, and they abode in the Calacadia, in the hills and the valleys within sound of the western sea, and though many of them went often about the land of the Valar, making far journeys in search of the secrets of land and water and all living things, yet the peoples of Tuna and Alqualonde drew together in those days. Finwë was king in Tirion, and Olwë in Aqualonde. But Ingwë was ever held the high king of all the elves. He abode thereafter at the feet of Manwë upon Taniquetil. Fëanor and his sons abode seldom in one place for long, but travelled far and wide upon the confines of Valinor, going even to the borders of the dark and the cold shores of the outer sea, seeking the unknown. Often there were guests in the halls of Ale, but Celegorum went rather to the house of Orome, and there he got great knowledge of birds and beasts, and all their tongues he knew. For all living things that are or have been in the kingdom of Arda, save only the fell and evil creatures of Melkor, lived then in the land of Aman. And there also were many other creatures that have not been seen upon Middle-earth, and perhaps never now shall be, since the fashion of the world was changed. Again, throwing forward this ominous ringing bell of fate here, right? Since the fashion of the world was changed. What is going to change the fashion of the world, you guys? We're going to get to it. Well, we're going to start it next week, in fact. The apocalypse is not so very far away. So, the Vanyar grow to love the land of the Valar, and they don't need to live in the Calacaria anymore. They don't need to live upon Tuna. They don't need to live in Tirion. They're happy to go full-time into Valinor, right? They're going to live all over the place. But Ingwë, the High King of all the elves, is going to live with Manwë upon Taniquetil. He is going to... Well, it's interesting, right? Because he's the High King. He's the eldest in terms of... Presumably he is the single eldest elf, right? Presumably he is the oldest of all the oldest. He is the oldest of the first clan, right? So we can assume, therefore, that he's the oldest of all the elves, and that gives him a kind of seniority. His high kingship status does not seem to be in any way questioned by Finwë or Olwë and Alqualonde. So he goes to Manwë, and it's tempting to read this as a kind of, I don't know, a co-positioning of kings, right? Ingwë and Manwë, they belong together. They're both the high kings of their, different domains. So presumably they just hang out in Taniquetil watching the game and talking about how great it is to be king. That is a possible interpretation, but there's something in the reading resists that. There's something in the reading, to me, at least, kind of wants me to pull back from that. And I think it's that there's something in the Vanyar, in the leaving of their kinship with the other elves that seems to bespeak a kind of excess of virtue, right? This very Tolkienian idea that it's good to have virtue, but if you have too much virtue, then it turns into vice, right? It's good to be proud, but if you're too prideful, that's where you get in trouble. It's good to be brave, but if you're too brave, then that turns into foolhardiness, right? It's this kind of, this is not quite a cowardly centrist philosophy, but there's something about the way that an excess of virtue can turn. And I wonder about the ways in which the Vanyar pass out of the story. I wonder in particular, we talked about the sundering of the elves as being a means of providing Tolkien with a diagrammatic taxonomy of all the elves, all the different kinds of elves that you encounter in different fairy stories, right? So you have the Vanyar that are the beautiful high elves, and you have the Noldor who are the crafty elves, and you have the Teleri who are more, abstracted and engaged in music and natural beauty, perhaps, than even the other elves are. And you have, the Sindarin who live in forests, and then the Sylvan who really, really live in forests. And we have these different aspects of the elves that are culturally familiar to us because they come to us filtered through, centuries and centuries of fairy stories. And one of the things that Tolkien gets with this great exodus from the east to the west, this diaspora of elven kind, is a number of categories of different kinds of elves. But I'm not sure what we get from the Vanyar passing out of the story of Arda, in effect, right? It's not just that they pass out of the story of Middle-earth, it's that they really play no further part as we move forward. And I'm not quite sure what he's getting at there. I need to think on that, and if you guys have thoughts, then by all means, do get in touch. For now, we're going to focus on something that is much more troubling, right? We know that Fëanor is trouble already. We know that Fëanor is trouble because his name means spirit of fire. And we know that Fëanor is trouble because he's introduced in the name of the chapter. So we know that he's very significant. Fëanor and his sons abode seldom in one place for long, but travelled far and wide upon the confines of Valinor, going even to the borders of the dark and the cold shores of the outer seas, seeking the unknown. Well, who does that remind us of? Does that sound at all familiar from the timeless halls before time? Melkor going out into the dark, going out into the void and seeking things, right? In his case, seeking the flame imperishable. But here we're seeing the same thing happen again. We're going out into the dark. We're going to the cold shores of the outer sea. Remember, this is the sea that encircles the world. There's nothing between the west coast of Aman and, the walls of night except the outer sea. That's the only thing. And no Eldar ever knows how deep or wide they are. It's tempting immediately to start reading Fëanor as being troubled, as being someone that we need to watch for sure, right? Even here before he really gets his due focus. But we also balance this with the interaction of his children with the rest of Valinor, right? Often they were guests in the halls of Ali, but Celegorm went rather to the house of Orome, right? And then we get the lovely detail about all of the animals, for all living things that are or have been in the kingdom of Arda, right? Save only the fell and evil creatures of Melkor. All the animals and plants that have ever existed in Middle-earth are found in Aman, right? Every single thing is there. You never have to go to Middle-earth if you just want to see like a particular kind of monkey or a particular, a counterclockwise swirled snail shell. You never have to go to Middle-earth to see those things because they're right there on Aman. They're right there nearby. And there are many other creatures that have not been seen upon Middle-earth and perhaps never now shall be since the fashion of the world was changed. There are definitely hippogriffs and unicorns and all of the big, heavy-hitting mythological monsters, right? I think this is where Tolkien is making a space for that kind of explanatory myth again. How do we know what a hippogriff looks like? How do we know what a unicorn looks like? Oh, well, because actually there were some in Aman, and when we got the books from the elves, when Ulfwin or whoever, travels across the Great Sea and finds himself in Elvenhome, manages to recover the books that form the basis for the Silmarillion as we are reading it now. Even here, I'm acknowledging the frame story that Christopher Tolkien deliberately left out, so maybe this is not completely fair, but that is why we have a sense of what unicorns are, is because they did once exist, and now they dwell only in Aman, right? That might be where we are. Gladrebecki's saying in the chat, I don't get the sense that the excess applies to the Vanyar. Seems more like a reflection on the lack of interesting story you can create when there's no conflict and fall. It's like something he wrote in The Hobbit about when they were, I think, in Rivendell. Something like they had comfort and everything was peaceful, so that part of the journey didn't make much of a tale to tell. I mean, that's fair, for sure. Yeah, I mean, maybe it is my narratological bias, right, that is pulling against this idea that actually the Vanyar did it right. Actually, the Vanyar did exactly what they ought to have done. But see, even then, you know what? I think I've just put my finger on it, Gladrebecki, and I think you're right. I think there is something to this, right? Because it's not so much that peace and contentment and unity, perfect unity, make a boring story, right? I mean, narratively, yes, that might be true, but that's not a reason not to do it if that is how your cosmology is shaping out. But this is a flawed world. This is Eldamar. Where is the grief and the growing of wisdom? Where is the change? Where is the struggle? Where is, the purpose of this creation? Where are the sorrows that will be turned by Iluvatar to greater beauty, right? What is Nienna doing with the Vanyar? Presumably nothing, because they're all just super chill the whole time. I don't know. I find that really interesting. Yeah. Okay, let's move on here. We're already quite late. How many slides do I have? I've got 5 or 6 slides here for introducing Fëanor. We can do it. Let's get through it. So, chapter 6, properly introducing Fëanor, right? He's kind of been here this whole time. We've had an accounting of him as we're talking about Eldamar, as we're talking about the Adalier, but now we're getting to Fëanor himself. Now the 3 kindreds of the Eldar were gathered at last in Valinor, and Melkor was chained. This was the noontide of the blessed realm, the fullness of its glory and its bliss, long in tale of years, but in the memory too brief. In those days the Eldar became full-grown in stature of body and of mind, and the Noldor advanced ever in skill and knowledge. And the long years were filled with their joyful labours, in which many new things fair and wonderful were devised. Then it was that the Noldor first bethought them of letters, and Rúmil of Tirion was the name of the lore master who first achieved fitting signs for the recording of speech and song, some for graving upon metal or in stone, others for drawing with brush or with pen. In that time was born in Eldamar, in the house of the king in Tirion upon the crown of Tuna, the eldest of the sons of Finwë and the most beloved. Finwë was his name, but by his mother he was called Fëanor, Spirit of Fire, and thus he is remembered in all the tales of the Noldor. So as I was saying about, that bell of doom, right? That sound on the horizon that tells you that something is not right. Now, the three kindreds of the Eldar were gathered at last in Valinor, and Melkor was chained. Fantastic. Hey, you guys, tick, 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 tick. We did it. All three clans of elves are here, the three kindreds of the Eldar, and Melkor is still chained. Excellent. But this is the noontide of the Blessed Realm, the fullness of its glory and its bliss, long in tale of years, but in memory too brief. This is going to pass. That is the nature of noontide, right? That it is a moment. It is a fleeting moment, and it will pass all too soon. And it will pass into, of course, darkness, right? Noon, that point at which the sun is highest in the sky. And you'll note this is being written from the perspective of people who have a concept of noon. This is written from the perspective of people who have a concept of the sun in the sky, which of course we still don't have. Outside of the light of the two trees, outside of Valinor, and that light which spills forth through the Pelori to hit Tol Eressëa, to hit Tuna, and to hit Tol Eressëa. Outside of that, the entire world is still dark. It's starlit outside of that. But these people, the author of this text, the point of view of this text, is coming from a place of familiarity with noon and with the sun. So, the Eldar become full-grown in stature of body and of mind, and the Noldor advance ever in skill and knowledge, right? They're living here with the Valar. They are perfecting their arts. They are becoming greater. They are becoming more even themselves. It's a process of maturation, I suppose, that's happening here. So mature are they, in fact, that the Noldor first think of letters. Rumil of Tirion is the name of the lore master who first achieved fitting science for the recording of speech and song. No other lore masters are recorded in this book, but of course, the guy who invents letters, that's the guy who's going to be here. Different kinds of letters, different alphabets even, right? Some that are for graving upon metal or in stone, so they have sharp angles and straight lines, and some that are for drawing with brush or with pen, more elegant, more curved, more looping. Pretty great stuff. And then the grandeur of this. You'll notice how Tolkien is the Silmarillion is written in a pretty high register throughout, right? The Silmarillion is pretty Bible all the way through, but there are moments still when Tolkien can just change gears, where he can just shift into a different rhetorical frame entirely, and that's exactly what we get here, right? Some for graving upon metal or in stone, others for drawing with brush or in pen. In that time was born in Eldamar, in the house of the king in Tirion, upon the crown of Tuna, the eldest of the sons of Finwë and the most beloved. Finwë, who becomes known as Fëanor. This is a part I was mentioning that passage in the Peoples of Middle-earth, I think it is, where we're talking more about elven culture and exactly how their families work, and it's accounted there, I think, that it's traditional for elves to receive a name first from their father shortly after they are born, and then later a name from their mother, which is usually more oriented around their character. It's usually more less descriptive of who you are. The father name usually involves a connection with the name of the father, right? It's kind of patronymic in that sense. But the mother name usually is something that is more specific and more poetic and more evocative of the nature of the character of the child. So we see that here, though it's not necessarily a one-to-one point of comparison. It's not clear how canonical that is in this version of the story, but it certainly tracks, right? That Finwë is his name, right? Finwë, Finwë. That means like the craft of Finwë, the crafty Finwë, essentially, right? Finwë was his name, but by his mother he was called Fëanor, Spirit of Fire, and thus he is remembered in all the tales of the Noldor. And if it is true, as it was in the earlier pages of the Silmarillion, I think, the more names you give something, the more important it is, right? We discussed this a few weeks ago. The more names something has, the more significant it is, because the more different people who speak different languages need to have a name for it, right? There's almost something counteroperative here. There's almost like the paradoxical counterpoint of that. Actually, if you're really important, if you're really famous, then you get one name. Everything else falls away, and one name is enough, right? You get to be Cher. You get to be Madonna. Like, you get to be this mononym that can just be known by everyone by this single unified name. Yes, exactly. Glad Rebecca's pointing out in the chat here. Style-wise, the Silmarillion is to the Lord of the Rings like the Old Testament is to the New Testament. Absolutely right, yes. Which is, of course, very conscious, right? That's... Although, yeah, I mean, I suppose that Lord of the Rings has a greater breadth of style, right? It has moments when it almost descends to The Hobbit. It almost becomes as casual, and which is not to say that The Hobbit is a very simplistic text. The Hobbit also has a range of rhetorical mode within it. But certainly, yes, The Lord of the Rings can descend almost to The Hobbit. I'm thinking, obviously, of the Hobbits in the Shire, right? It feels very companionable, feels very familiar to the pages of The Hobbit. But boy, it can also rise. It can also reach the heights that are not, I think, incompatible with our notion of the Silmarillion. But you're absolutely right, yeah. Yeah, Glorfin David's pointing out here, when you say style-wise, do you mean both as translated into English? Yes, that's the problem, right? It's again, to wrestle with this fictional frame. I think I'm going to do a bonus episode on the frame story. I think I've maybe said this before, but it is one of the things that's ticking away in the back of my head, is that I want to do a podcast episode, just dedicated to the frame story, kind of explaining what it is and where it comes from and what the different versions are that account for the passing into the hands of Professor Tolkien and the translating into English of actual books from Middle-earth, right? Actual book, and in this case, from Aman too, right? There are a couple of different versions of the story, but the most common one is an Anglo-Saxon sailor winding up in Tol Eressëa, I guess, right? Some version of that lonely island there, and receiving the books, and it's a little tough to pin down exactly, and it's a little tough to see. I mean, I was going to say it's a little tough to see what Tolkien gets from doing it, but it's not tough to see what Tolkien gets from doing it. What he gets is a mythological authenticity. What he gets is the idea that myths, in order to be significant and to be pervasive and to have a kind of cultural weight, particularly an ongoing cultural weight, require diversity, a kind of internal diversity. You need to have different people telling different versions of the same story in order for a myth to really persist in the real world. That's kind of how it works out. The stories that have big cultural weight to us are the stories that are retold in different places with slightly different details, right? I'm thinking of the works of Charles Perrault, when he sat down to basically first record the previously oral tradition of fairy tales, of fairy stories, right? So he sits down and he gathers together all of these different versions of Sleeping Beauty and all these different versions of Cinderella, and he writes them down and observes that there are incompatibilities within the various texts that are presented here, right? Different people in different villages tell this story differently, but that there is a power to that. And when you go to a different village and you hear a version of the story that's almost like the version of the story that you know, it doesn't detract from the authenticity of the myth. It doesn't detract. It doesn't make it harder for you to invest your belief in the story, right? Or I guess, not to sidetrack myself completely, it makes the suspension of disbelief easier rather than harder to see these two different versions of the story side by side. And when there are 10 different stories or 12 different stories or 100 different stories that are all close but not quite they're overlapping but they're not quite identical, that gives it a kind of cultural power. I find that stuff fascinating, and I do think that Tolkien is wanting to do that. I think that that's part of the idea, is that he's giving himself a documentary history in the absence of this diasporic history, right? It cannot be the case that this book that he is writing is itself a paratext, right? Although, weirdly, ultimately, with the fantastic work done by Christopher Tolkien in the collection of the history of Middle-earth, everything ends up being a paratext. Everything ends up being in conversation with other versions of itself, but they're all authored by Tolkien, right? It's a completely... I'm hesitating, as I often do, before I make a very declamatory statement, and I want to think it through. I think it's a completely unique body of work. I think it's an unparalleled body of work in terms of how it is almost inadvertently imitative of the way that myth and story spreads through actual connected culture, rather than coming from the pen of an individual author, an individual human being. I don't think there's anything like it. Yeah. Okay, let's move on, because we have to, because you guys are great and you're distracting me as I'm trying to get through the last of these slides. So, introducing Fëanor. We've done this, right? So, Cota Finwë is his name. By his mother, he is called Fëanor, Spirit of Fire. Thus, he is remembered in all the tales of the Noldor, right? Throwing forward again. Let's talk about his mom. Miriel was the name of his mother, who was called Serinde because of her surpassing skill in weaving and needlework, for her hands were more skilled to fineness than any hands even among the Noldor. The love of Finwë and Miriel was great and glad, for it began in the blessed realm in the days of bliss. But in the bearing of her son, Miriel was consumed in spirit and body, and after his birth she yearned for release from the labour of living. And when she had named him, she said to Finwë, "Never again shall I bear child, for strength that would have nourished the life of many has gone forth into Fëanor." Then Finwë was grieved, for the Noldor were in the youth of their days, and he desired to bring forth many children into the bliss of Aman. And he said, "Surely there is healing in Aman. Here all weariness can find rest." But when Miriel languished still, Finwë sought the counsel of Manwë, and Manwë delivered her to the care of Irnamo and Lorien. At their parting, for a little while, as he thought, Finwë was sad, for it seemed an unhappy chance that the mother should depart and miss the beginning at least of the childhood days of her son. "It is indeed unhappy," said Miriel, "and I would weep if I were not so weary. But hold me blameless in this, and in all that may come after." She went then to the gardens of Lorien and lay down to sleep. But though she seemed to sleep, her spirit indeed departed from her body and passed in silence to the halls of Mandos. The maidens of Este tended the body of Miriel, and it remained unwithered, but she did not return. Then Finwë lived in sorrow, and he went often to the gardens of Lorien, and sitting beneath the silver willows beside the body of his wife, he called her by her names, but it was unavailing, and alone in all the blessed realm he was deprived of joy. After a while, he went to Lorien no more. So, in a sense, our first on-screen death of an elf. And it is difficult to unpack from this what ideology we bring to it, right? As I said earlier, there are people out there who blame Finwë for all that comes. There are people out there who blame Fëanor for all that comes. I think both of those carry some share of the burden of blame, and others besides, of course, absolutely. Miriel is the one that I have trouble with. Miriel is the one that I, perhaps just because of her words, that I find blameless. I do not see here a failing of character. I see here something much more profound. And to really understand that profundity, I think we have to recognize the narrative mode that we're in here as we're talking about the Valar, right? We kind of have to rewind in our brains to the Valaquenta. We kind of have to go back in time to talking about each of the Valar and their powers and their domains and all of the superlatives that we're given, right? We're given so many moments of comparison, right? It's kind of an absolute comparison as we move through the Valaquenta that these things, declamatory, these things will be true forever for all people, right? If you go to the gardens of Lorien, you will be healed in mind and body and spirit. There's no asterisk attached to that. There's no chance there. It's something else entirely. So what has happened to Miriel is unique. It is something, well, I say it is unique. It is something which will become, I think, to some degree, a part of the elven character as we move forward. But this is certainly our first time recognizing it, and it's the most stark moment that I can think of in any of the story of men or elves to come. So she is skilled, right? That's the first thing that we get from her. She, like Fëanor is going to be, is incredibly skilled. Her surpassing skill in weaving and needlework, for her hands were more skilled to fineness than any hands, even among the Noldor, right? Wow, she's amazing. She's, again, the kind of superlatives that we often get. She's absolutely the paragon of her craft here. The love of Finwë and Miriel was great and glad, for it began in the blessed realm in the days of bliss. Everything is perfect here. Everything is perfect. But in the bearing of her son, Miriel is consumed in spirit and body, and after his birth she yearned for release from the labor of the living. And when she had named him, she said to Finwë, "Never again shall I bear child, for strength that would have nourished the life of many has gone forth into Fëanor." She feels herself to be depleted. And this is not, I think, metaphor, right? It would be it would be incredibly destructive, I think, to read this as a kind of modern, psychologically understood postpartum depression, right? A real and terrible and complicated thing that many, many people have to deal with and navigate, right? That is to take nothing away from the real phenomenon of postpartum depression. But what we're seeing here is something that is more like, I think, the kind of investment of energy that we see from the Valar. The immortal spirits within Arda are not capable of endless toil. And we're coming now in the narrative to a point where we can really begin to understand that and we can really point to things. But you'll remember, right, when first we are resting in the first residence of the Valar, right, when we're in the midst of the Great Lake back in Middle-earth, when everything is great, when the lamps have been erected and everyone's just chilling out, because Aule and Tukas specifically are tired. They are fatigued. They have sent forth their energy into the world, and it cannot now simply or quickly be restored. We've seen, and will see again, that when something is created and then destroyed, it cannot simply be created again, right? We're going to get an absolutely blistering opportunity to talk about that next week, and to some extent the following week, as we talk about the darkening of Valinor, right? When things are created and destroyed, or when things are, when there is an investment of power in the creation of something, it drains you. It takes something from you. And if that is true of the Valar, it is equally true, perhaps, of the elves, though the elves have much less store of power within themselves. Miriel has created, as she says, for strength that would have nourished the life of many has gone forth into Fëanor. Not 2, not 3, many. How many could she possibly be? All of that has gone forth into Fëanor. Is Fëanor to blame for this? Has he taken the strength? Has he drawn vampirically the life essence of his mother? It doesn't seem to be the case. It doesn't seem to be conscious. It doesn't seem to be, a thing. But again, this is Arda Mard. Things are not proceeding as they should. And now that we have come down from the tier of the Valar, of the Maiar, of the creation of Middle-earth itself, of Arda itself, now we're dealing with people, right? Not yet people, not yet human beings, not yet men, but elves have a recognizable psychology. And as we come down, we're beginning to see the consequences of that corruption play out. Then Finwë was grieved, for the Noldor were in the youth of their days. He desired to bring forth many children into the bliss of Aman, and he said, surely there's healing. Oh, God, I'm sorry you're feeling that way. I really want to have lots of kids, though, is the thing. Have you seen the world? It's so good. We should have more elves to enjoy it. I really think that maybe if you go and lay down a bit, maybe we can have some more kids. Does that seem like a thing we can do? Here, is there healing in Aman? Here, all weariness can find rest, right? He believes in this perfect, unmarred vision of Aman as it's presented to him, which, I mean, he has reason to, right? It is noontime in Valinor. It's the best that things are going to be. He has no reason to believe that this isn't a perfect solution to all problems that can afflict the elves. But when Miriel languished still, Finwë sought the counsel of Manwë, and Manwë delivered her to the care of Irmo and Lorien. Irmo, of course, you'll remember, is the actual real name of Lorien, who is usually called Lorien because of his healing gardens, right? At their parting for a little while. So Finwë thinks, okay, we'll deliver her, we'll send her off to the spa, give her, as much time as she needs to recover and recuperate, and then maybe things will be okay again. Maybe things will be fine, right? Finwë was sad, for it seemed an unhappy chance that the mother should depart and miss the beginning, at least, of the childhood days of her son. I'm so sorry, you're going to miss Fëanor, kind of starting to grow up a little bit. You're going to miss some part of his childhood, and that sucks. And Miriel says, it is indeed unhappy, and I would weep if I were not so weary. But hold me blameless in this, and all that may come after. She's conscious, I think, of what is going to happen and the effect that birthing Fëanor has had upon her. She is aware of the grandeur of him, I think, probably, right? Like the power of him. She's aware that all of this strength has flowed into him. The strength that would have nourished the lives of many has gone forth into Fëanor, but it has been taken from her. Her spirit has been weakened by the birth of Fëanor. So then she goes into the gardens of Lorien and she lays down to sleep, as one should, right? That is the right thing to do. If you were seeking healing of body and spirit in Valinor, you go to the gardens of Lorien and you lay down, and maybe you sleep, maybe you just read a book or something, browse your phone for a little bit. But no, she sleeps, and though she seemed to sleep, her spirit departs from her body and passed into silence in the halls of Mandos. She dies. She chooses, it would seem, to die. The maidens of Este tended the body of Miriel, and it remained unwithered because there's no need for it to wither, right? But crucially, she did not return. This is the first moment in the Silmarillion as it's presented to us. And of course, I've talked a lot this evening about expanded material and other versions of other stories and other accounts. And it's always tempting to go to the history of Middle-earth and read it like it is supplementary material. Read it like it is all supposed to be true and that it is all directly applicable to the reading of the Silmarillion that you're doing. But I want to fight back against that. I want to read the Silmarillion as it's presented to us because it unlocks, I think, greater wonder and greater immediacy if instead of looking at this like it is a Wikipedia page, we look at it like it is a story, right? I think that this is a powerful moment. The maidens of Este, right? The Maiar who are in service to Este, the wife of Lorien, are taking care of her body, which remains unwithered because there's no reason for the body of Miriel to wither or decay here in the gardens of Lorien, right? But her soul does not return. And this is the first time that we're talking about souls coming back from the halls of Mandos. This is the first time that we're talking about the possibility of, well, a kind of reincarnation, right? This is the first time we're wrestling with this complicated idea that you don't necessarily go to the halls of Mandos forever. You're not necessarily just exiting your body, going to the halls of Mandos and waiting for the days after days, for the second singing of the music. You can come back. But Miriel chooses not to, which is, in a sense, all the worse, right? Because she could. It's one thing for someone to die. It's one thing for there to be a moment of grief. But the thing about this choice is that it is an ongoing choice, that she could presumably return at any point and doesn't. So drained is she. Then Finwë lived in sorrow, and he went often to the gardens of Lorien, and sitting beneath the silver willows beside the body of his wife, he called her by her names. But it was unavailing, and alone in all the blessed realm he was deprived of joy. After a while he went to Lorien no more. I mean, that is just a very human, very tragic moment of narrative, right? It's a moment of real reflection and humanization of Finwë, the king of the Noldor and Tyrion upon Tuna. But no, he's the only one now who does not feel the joy of the noontide of Valinor. He is the only one who is not feeling the joy of the Blessed Realm at this point. But this, of course, is not where his story ends. All his love he gave thereafter to his son, and Fëanor grew swiftly, as if a secret fire were kindled within him. He was tall, and fair of face, and masterful, his eyes piercingly bright, and his hair raven dark. In the pursuit of all his purposes eager and steadfast. Few ever changed his courses by counsel, none by force. He became of all the Noldor, then or after, the most subtle in mind and the most skilled in hand. In his youth, bettering the work of Rumil, he devised those letters which bear his name, and which the elder used ever after. It was he who, first of all the Noldor, discovered how gems greater and brighter than those of the earth might be made with skill. The first gems that Fëanor made were white and colourless, but being set under starlight they would blaze with blue and silver fires brighter than Helluin. And other crystals he made also, wherein things far away could be seen small but clear, as with the eyes of the eagles of Manwë. Seldom were the hands and mind of Fëanor at rest. While still in his early youth, he wedded Nerdanel, the daughter of a great smith named Matan, among those of the Noldor most dear to Aule, and of Matan he learned much of the making of things in metal and in stone. Nerdanel also was firm of will, but more patient than Fëanor, desiring to understand minds rather than to master them, and at first she restrained him when the fire of his heart grew too hot. But his later deeds grieved her, and they became estranged. 7 sons she bore to Fëanor. Her mood she bequeathed in part to some of them, but not to all. So, now we've got trouble. Now things are starting to fall apart, right? In the absence of Miriel, we're seeing the passion, all this love, right? The grief too, I'm sure, being poured into the son. Fëanor grows swiftly. But look here, even the ways that he is being described ought to give us pause. He was tall and fair of face and masterful. His eyes piercingly bright and his hair raven dark. In the pursuit of all his purposes, eager and steadfast. Pretty good, right? Few ever changed his courses by counsel, none by force. Who does not take counsel? Who does not seek, the wisdom of others? Who has no use for that kind of companionship here? This secret fire that is kindled within him ought, of course, to be making us think of the flame imperishable. Yes, absolutely, right? And when the fire burns too hot, maybe he just has too much Fëa within him, right? Fëa here meaning the fire, of course, but also the spirit of the living thing. Maybe he just has too much Fëa. But we're also clearly supposed to be drawing connections back to Melkor, right? He's so skilled, he's so useful. But then again, right, he became of all the Noldor, then or after, the most subtle in mind and the most skilled in hand. Subtle is not a word that Tolkien uses as a compliment. That is not a word that is a good word, right? It's exactly the same way as we distinguish between like Saruman and Gandalf, right? The craft of Saruman is of a darker sort. It is of a slyer sort, right? It's not virtuous to be sneaky. It's not virtuous to be subtle. That is not generally considered a good thing in the pages of The Lord of the Rings or here in the Silmarillion. So we see here too the creation of the Tengwar, right? The alphabet that we now think of as being, right, this is what Elven language looks like. It looks like the script created here by Fëanor. He devised those letters which bear his name. They bear his name in that they are sometimes called Fëanorian letters or Fëanorian script, but usually Tengwar, right? And then he creates new gems. Fake gems? Different gems? I mean, fake in the sense that they did not come from the earth, but they're real in their own way, right? The first gems that Fëanor made were white and colorless, but being set under starlight, they would blaze with blue and silver fires brighter than Helwan. Remember Helwan, the star that we noted rising at the moment of the birth, at the moment of the awakening of the firstborn children? Other crystals he made also, wherein things far away could be seen small but clear, as with the eyes of the eagles of Manwë. This is a really interesting one, because there are scholars out there who make the direct comparison to, or not the direct comparison, excuse me, they will tell you that the reference here is to the Palantiri, that what Fëanor is making is at least one Palantir, right? You'll remember the crystal orbs used so wildly in The Lord of the Rings, so dangerously too. And generally speaking, in the expanded material, Fëanor is credited with the creation of the Palantiri. But I wonder about this. The Palantiri can be used to see things far away, right? But I don't know if this is how I would choose to describe the experience of using a Palantir, at least if we're seeking to make that a direct reference and to make it compatible with the reader's experience of The Lord of the Rings. I don't know that if I'm talking about, and he made a Palantir through which things far away could be seen small but clear, as with the eyes of the eagles of Manwë. I'm not sure that I get that. I think my inclination here is to read this as lenses, right? Because he's making these gems white and colorless, right? He's making these gems that are transparent, and I wonder if what we're seeing here are, the creation of lenses. If he's creating telescopes, if he's creating microscopes, if he's creating, more likely, right, like what do they call that, a jeweler's loop, right, the little lensing monocle that jewelers can use to finally inspect gems, the kind of thing that Fëanor is not only spending a lot of time doing now, but will definitely need in the near future. I wonder if that's what we're supposed to take from that. But this is one of those moments when the expanded material has kind of swamped the book and has kind of just overwashed the detail here, and the readers are, if you're familiar with the expanded material, almost encouraged to jump straight to Palantiri here. Then he marries Nerdanel, of whom, this is just a great little narrative trick here, of whom we learn almost nothing, right? We don't really know anything about Nerdanel, but the description of Nerdanel tells us more about Fëanor himself. Nerdanel also was firm of will. Fëanor is firm of will, but she's more patient than Fëanor. Fëanor is impatient, desiring to understand minds rather than to master them. Oh no. Fëanor wants to master minds rather than understand them. And at first she restrained him when the fires of his heart grew too hot, but his later deeds grieved her and they became estranged. And also, 7 sons she bore to Fëanor, her mood she bequeathed in part to some of them, but not to all. Oh no, double oh no, things are going to go bad here. Let's keep going here. Because this is the real catastrophe, right? Things could almost be okay, right? Obviously, Fëanor is a very challenging individual even by this point in the narrative, and what happened to Miriel is nothing short of tragic, and even what happened to Finwë, nothing short of tragic, right? Absolutely awful things going down in Tirion upon Tuna, but we're not done, because Finwë is going to make a choice that is going to really lead to catastrophe. Now, it came to pass that Finwë took as his second wife Indis the Fair. She was of Vanya, close kin of Ingwe the High King, golden-haired and tall, and in all ways unlike Miriel. Finwë loved her greatly and was glad again. But the shadow of Miriel did not depart from the house of Finwë, nor from his heart, and of all whom he loved, Fëanor had ever the chief share of his thought. The wedding of his father was not pleasing to Fëanor, and he had no great love for Indis, nor for Fingolfin and Finarfin her sons. He lived apart from them, exploring the land of Aman, or busying himself with the knowledge and the crafts in which he delighted. In those unhappy things which later came to pass, and in which Fëanor was the leader, many saw the effect of this breach within the house of Finwë, judging that if Finwë had endured his loss and been content with the fathering of his mighty son, the courses of Fëanor would have been otherwise, and great evil might have been prevented. For the sorrow and the strife in the house of Finwë is graven in the memory of the Noldorin elves. But the children of Indis were great and glorious, and their children also, and if they had not lived, the history of the Eldar would have been diminished. So we're kind of getting an anticipatory maneuver here with the turning of evil to good, right? We have not yet seen the evil, but maybe if the evil hadn't happened, the good things would not have been so good either, right? It's kind of a reverse of the normal eucatastrophic play that we see in the pages of Tolkien's work. So Finwë is taken with Indis the Fair, right? We get he loved her greatly and was glad again, but he didn't love her as much as he loved Fëanor, because what he really loves is the shadow of Miriel that still lives, still endures, not lives, still is metaphorically present in the house of Finwë, right? The house of Finwë, even there, doubly metaphorical, right? Metonymic almost for both the place of his dwelling, but also his family tree, also the clan that springs forth from Finwë. And Fëanor does not like the wedding. He has no great love for Indis, nor for Fingolfin and Finarfin. He lives apart from them. He explores the land of Aman. He busies himself with the knowledge and the crafts in which he delights. He withdraws. He retreats. And again, we're seeing some of that specific antipathy, right? One of the things which is so definitive of Melkor in the early stages of the Silmarillion is the way that we keep drawing lines of specific and peculiar enmity between Melkor and the Valar, right? He hates Yavanna because she turned him down. Varda, because she turned him down in the days before days. He hates Ale because Ale is most like him. He hates Manwë because Manwë is like second fiddle to him, but then really gets the plum job that he wants. He hates Olmo because, I don't know, oceans and stuff, right? Like, because there are trackless depths. We have these specific lines of enmity that we're here seeing again being replicated by Fëanor, of a smaller form, for sure, right? Of a more, it's the same song in a it's the same song in a minor key, which is a weird metaphor that I do not cleave to at this point. It is the same structure, albeit at a smaller scale, for sure. And all of this foreshadowing too. We'll be able to talk when all is said and done, whether Finwë bears any blame for what happens in the days to come, or whether, well, I guess there are two separate questions there, right? Does Finwë bear any blame? And had Finwë dedicated himself to the loving of his mighty son, would things have turned out differently? I think those are two very separate questions as we move forward. But we're not done with bad things happening in Valinor, because it's not just Fëanor. Now, even while Fëanor and the craftsmen of the Noldor worked with delight, foreseeing no end to their labours, and while the sons of Indis grew to their full stature, the noontide of Valinor was drawing to its close. For it came to pass that Melkor, as the Valar had decreed, completed the term of his bondage, dwelling for 3 ages in the duress of Mandos alone. At length, as Manwë had promised, he was brought again before the thrones of the Valar. Then he looked upon their glory and their bliss, and envy was in his heart. He looked upon the children of Ilúvatar that sat at the feet of the mighty, and hatred filled him. He looked upon the wealth of bright gems, and he lusted for them, and he hid his thoughts, and postponed his vengeance. Before the gates of Valmor, Melkor abased himself at the feet of Manwë and sued for pardon, vowing that if he might be made only the least of the free people of Valinor, he would aid the Valar in all their works, and most of all in the healing of the many hurts that he had done to the world. And Nienna aided his prayer, but Mandos was silent. And if we're speaking of blame, if I think that Miriel is blameless in all that occurs, I'm going to put a stake in the ground here and also free Nienna of any blame that happens to be going around. You can read some speculation out there. You can read some emotional responses to this part of the Silmarillion out there on the wilds of the internet that will completely blame Nienna. Not completely blame Nienna, that's not fair, but will in part blame Nienna for her part in the freeing of Melkor. And I think that is unfair, because what else is Nienna to do? She does not possess judgment. She does not limit her empathy. That is not her job. It is not her purpose. It is not her domain. She weeps for the griefs of Arda, and there is no version of events in which Melkor is not one of the griefs of Arda, right? He is one of the griefs of all creation. His fall is the thing that causes all else to fall apart. It is the first marring, right? Nienna does not bind her pity to those who are deserving of it, which is infinitely to her credit. Much, much later, we are going to see the Maiar who spends the time with Nienna, who learns from her the ways of empathy and of pity too, right? Gandalf, when he comes into Middle-earth, we are going to see him exhibit much the same kind of universal pity and sorrow. He is able to feel the grief of those who have been grieved, regardless of their position, regardless of their situation, to understand truly the tragedy, and in so doing, begin to turn that sorrow into wisdom, which is, I think, exactly what Nienna is doing here. Judgment is not her domain. Judgment is the domain of Mandos, right? Except, Well, there's an interesting nuance there in the title Doomsman of the Valar, right? He is the Doomsman of the Valar, but not, it would seem, of the Valar. He does not judge the Valar in the same way. He is more he is the one among the Valar who is the judge, not the judge of the Valar, if that makes sense. And I think that he is withholding here because the appeal is to Manwë. Manwë as king of the Valar. It is his call. So we see again a similar pattern of evil and enmity here, right? We see the malevolence here in the heart of Melkor. He simply lies. He hides it. He buries all of these feelings that he has, the envy and the hatred and the lust, the desire for the bright gems. He hides his thoughts and postpones his vengeance and pretends to be reformed. If he be made only the least of the free people of Valinor, he would aid the Valar in all their works, and most of all in the healing of the many hurts he had done to the world. I'm so sorry. It's been 3 long ages of Vailian years that I have been trapped here, and I'm sorry. I repent. I would like to fix the damage. Can you give me community service? Can you give me some kind of deferred sentence so that I can go and undo all the terrible harm that I have done? And thus, our last slide of this evening, it's a monster, but wow, this is the last slide of the evening. Then Manwë granted him pardon, but the Valar would not yet suffer him to depart beyond their sight and vigilance, and he was constrained to dwell within the gates of Valmar. But fair seeming were all the words and deeds of Melkor in that time, and both the Valar and the Eldar had profit from his aid and counsel if they sought it. And therefore in a while he was given leave to go freely about the land, and it seemed to Manwë that the evil of Melkor was cured, for Manwë was free from evil, and could not comprehend it. And he knew that in the beginning, in the thought of Ilúvatar, Melkor had been even as he. And he saw not to the depths of Melkor's heart, and did not perceive that all love had departed from him forever. But Ulmo was not deceived, and Tuckus clenched his hands whenever he saw Melkor his foe go by. For if Tuckus is slow to wrath, he is slow also to forget. But they obeyed the judgment of Manwë, for those who will defend authority against rebellion must not themselves rebel. Now in his heart Melkor most hated the Eldar, both because they were fair and joyful, and because in them he saw the reason for the arising of the Valar and his own downfall. Therefore all the more did he feign love for them and seek their friendship, and he offered them the service of his lore and labour in any great deed that they would do. The Vanyar indeed held him in suspicion, for they dwelt in the light of the trees and were content. And to the Teleri he gave small heed, thinking them of little worth, tools too weak for his designs. But the Noldor took delight in his hidden knowledge that he could reveal to them, and some hearkened to words that it would have been better for them never to have heard. Melkor indeed declared afterward that Fëanor had learned much art from him in secret, and had been instructed by him in the greatest of all his works. But he lied in his lust and his envy, for none of the Eldalier ever hated Melkor more than Fëanor, son of Finwë, who first named him Morgoth. And snared though he was in the webs of Melkor's malice against the Valar, he held no converse with him, and took no counsel from him. For Fëanor was driven by the fire of his own heart only, working ever swiftly and alone, and he asked the aid and sought the counsel of none that dwelt in Aman, great or small, save only and for a little while of Nerdanel the wise, his wife. The juxtaposition here, the contrast between Melkor and Fëanor as we move through this passage is just so good. It's this card trick, a little 3-card Monty of who's the real bad guy here. It's fantastic. So Manwë grants Melkor pardon because Melkor is lying, and Manwë cannot fathom the idea of deceit is effectively what we've got. For Manwë was free from evil and could not comprehend it, and he knew that in the beginning in the thought of Ilúvatar Melkor had been even as he, and he saw not to the depths of Melkor's heart, and did not perceive that all love had departed from him forever. But, crucially, Ulmo was not deceived, and Tuckus clenched his hands whenever he saw Melkor his foe go by. Are we to infer from this that Ulmo and Tuckus are not free from evil? If it is really, but Manwë was free from evil and could not comprehend it, if that is really the reason that Manwë makes the judgment that he makes and frees Melkor, albeit on a limited basis at first, right? First he's restricted to Valmar, but he's so convincing in his repentance that eventually he's free to go wherever he wants. Is it really that Manwë is free from evil and cannot comprehend this? Or is it, in fact, that second thought? For in the beginning, in the thought of Ilúvatar, Melkor had been even as he. Is Manwë recognizing a kinship here? Is he recognizing a similarity? Is he recognizing something deeper within Melkor that is not the real fear and hate and anger and all of the shame, right, that turns into anger that Melkor has experienced. Is he not recognizing that, but he's recognizing something more subtle but profound? Again, I'm using the word subtle here, and I want to step back from that. Something more elusive and possibly profound? What is Manwë thinking as we move through here? If Ulmo and Tukas are not deceived, is this suggesting that Ulmo and Tukas are less capable of pity, are less capable of forgiveness? Well, I don't know about that, because I see the comparison. Tukas for sure, right? Absolutely, right? Slow to anger, slow to wrath, but also slow to forget. Also slow to forgive, for sure. Tukas makes sense. The inclusion of Ulmo here, and I've drawn the comparison before between Ulmo and Nienna, right? And not just the water, but in a way the water, in a way the expression of pity through tears does seem to connect the two in an interesting way. So I'm not sure how to really parse all of this. We'll keep track of it as we go forward. And then Melkor goes out among the Eldar, right? He hates them because they are fair and joyful, but because in them he sees the reason for the arising of the Valar and his own downfall. If not for the children of Iluvatar, there would never have been an Ea. There would never have been a creation of this universe. There would never have been a descent into Arda, and all that has happened to him, all that he feels so righteously indignant about, would not have occurred. So he hates them, so he goes to them and, well, helps them, right? Not the Vanyar, they're not any good to him, and not the Teleri, because, I mean, really, they're just messing around in their swan boats. Who cares about them? But the Noldor, the crafty ones, the craftsmen of the elves, yes, that's his target right there. So he goes and he teaches them his ways, teaches them different ways of looking at the world, different ways of exercising one's mastery over the world, perhaps different techniques for leveraging reality and turning it to your purpose and your will. But not Fëanor. He will say later, as we get here, right? Melkor indeed declared afterward that Fëanor had learned much art from him in secret and had been instructed by him in the greatest of all his works. And if you are reading this for the first time, then you can think, God damn, I knew there was something about that Fëanor kid. I knew that kid would end up being taught by Melkor how to make bad things. But no. He lied in his lust and his envy, for none of the Eldalier ever hated Melkor more than Fëanor, son of Finwë, who first named him Morgoth. Right? We're going to get to that. That's a thing that's going to happen in the very near future. But that's the relationship. It's not always two there are, right? It's not the Sith Master and the Apprentice here. It's not a Palpatine and Vader situation. Instead, Fëanor is fueled by his hatred. He feels the same hatred that Melkor feels. They are more alike than either one of them might admit. And with all of this foreshadowing, with all of this danger on the horizon, we are going to call it quits right there. Next week, February 20th, probably the same 7 p.m. Central Time, if you guys can make it and join me live. We're going to cover Chapter 7 and 8 of the Quenta, in which we discuss the creation of the Silmarils themselves, and then the darkening of Valinor and the greatest and most fearsome of the servants of Melkor. It's a banger next week, you guys. If you weren't so engaged by, the family trees and some of the discussions and the dubious questions of what happened to Miriel in her grief and in her sorrow and in the taking of her strength by Fëanor, if this has not lit a fire under you, if the swan boats didn't do it for you, definitely come back next week, because let me tell you, we are going to have a scorcher of a session that may run even longer than this extended session. Thank you so much for joining me live in the chat, Becky and David. It's been so good to see you. I'm so glad that you've been hanging out. That's it. I know. I wish that I could continue on for another 2 hours too, but I honestly have to go and start work on my bonus episode for tomorrow, where I'm talking about Harlequin romance and trying to release a little something for Valentine's Day. So that's going to be tomorrow. This has been an absolute pleasure. As ever, listeners at home, if you would like to support this endeavor and help me actually sit in front of this microphone for, let's say, 10, 12 hours a day talking about Tolkien and all related subjects, head on over to patreon.com/nextword. You can pledge a couple bucks there to help me keep making shows. You can pledge a little more over there. For $8 a month, you get access to all of the bonus episodes. Yeah, sure, that's great. There are like 40 of them. They're awesome. But you can also get on the list to receive an actual, in real life, in your mailbox little zine that I'm going to start putting together every 3 months. It's going to be every quarter. The first is going to go out in March. So if you want to get to that, don't hesitate. Get your name on that list so that I can start crafting and printing up these little 8-page zines that are going to have essays and stories and poems and puzzles. I'm already working on a somewhat fiendish Tolkien expanded legendarium kind of crossword puzzle for that. So that's going to be a ton of fun. And of course, all of this is possible thanks to you guys. Thanks to the wonderful patrons of Next Word. Patreon.com/nextword. That is going to do it. Thank you so much for spending your evening with me, or your lunchtime, your morning, whenever you happen to be listening to this. I hope that you will be able to join me live next week for the darkening of Valinor and the creation of the Silmarils. This is when it gets really good, you guys. That'll do it for this week. Thanks so much for listening.